The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, descendants of heaven and earth, and what these ancient texts reveal about what happened after their arrival might change how you think about the very foundations of civilization. The story begins not with aliens or ancient astronauts, despite what popular culture might tell you, but with something far more fascinating. Real tablets, real cities, real people who lived in the dust and mud of southern Iraq 5,000 years ago, who looked up at the stars and asked the same questions we ask today. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What forces shaped our world? And they wrote down their answers in the world's first written language, preserving them in clay that would survive millennia. These weren't primitive people scrawling simple myths. The Sumerians were sophisticated urban dwellers who invented mathematics, created complex legal systems, developed astronomical charts, and built irrigation networks that transformed barren desert into fertile farmland. They were engineers, astronomers, poets, and priests, and their texts about the Anunnaki weren't meant as fiction or fantasy. These were their sacred histories, their explanations for the world they inhabited, their understanding of the divine forces that governed existence. To understand what happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to Sumerian texts, we need to understand who the Sumerians were, what Mesopotamia was like, and how these clay tablets survived to tell their tales. Imagine standing on the flat plains of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers wind their way toward the Persian Gulf. The land here is hot, dusty, and unforgiving. Without the rivers, nothing would grow, but with them, with careful management of their waters, this became the cradle of civilization itself. The geography shaped everything. Mesopotamia means land between rivers in Greek, though the people who lived there called it by many names. The Sumerians referred to their homeland as Kengir, the land of civilized lords. The rivers brought life, but they also brought danger. Unlike the Nile, which flooded predictably each year, the Tigris and Euphrates were temperamental. They could bring devastating floods with little warning, washing away entire settlements. They could shift course, abandoning cities that depended on them. This unpredictability shaped Sumerian religion and mythology profoundly. Their gods, like their rivers, were powerful and capricious. The earliest settlements in southern Mesopotamia date back to around 6000 BCE, but what we recognize as Sumerian civilization emerged around 4000 BCE during what archaeologists call the Uruk period, named after one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Uruk, the city of the legendary king Gilgamesh, grew to cover more than 2 square miles, with a population approaching 100,000 people. This happened at a time when most of humanity still lived in small villages or followed herds as nomadic pastoralists. Uruk was revolutionary. Other great cities followed. Eridu, which the Sumerians believed was the first city ever created, established directly by the gods. Ur, whose royal tombs would later yield treasures of gold and lapis lazuli. Nippur, the religious center where Enlil himself was said to dwell. Lagash, Kish, Shrupak, each an independent city-state with its own ruler, its own patron deity, and its own ambitions. These cities were connected by canals and trade routes, sharing a common language and culture, yet frequently at war with one another over water rights, territory, and prestige. The Sumerians didn't build with stone, which was scarce in the river plains. They built with mud, brick, sun-dried, or kiln-fired, creating massive temple complexes called ziggurats that rose in step tiers toward the sky. These weren't just places of worship. They were economic centers, administrative headquarters, and astronomical observatories. The priests who served in these temples weren't just religious officials. They were accountants, astronomers, engineers, and scribes who managed the complex irrigation systems that made civilization possible. And it was these scribes who developed writing, not to record poetry or prayers initially, but to keep track of grain stores, livestock, and labor. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to around 3300 BCE, are accounting records, pictographs showing jars of oil, heads of cattle, measures of barley. But from these humble beginnings, cuneiform script evolved into a sophisticated writing system capable of expressing abstract concepts, legal codes, mathematical formulas, astronomical observations, and eventually mythology. The myths came later, but they incorporated older oral traditions that may have stretched back centuries or even millennia before anyone thought to write them down. When Sumerian scribes finally began recording their sacred stories around 2500 BCE, they were preserving traditions that already felt ancient to them. These stories explained how the world came to be, where humans came from, why we suffer, why we die, and what our relationship to the divine powers should be. At the center of these myths stood the Anunnaki, a word that appears throughout Sumerian and later Akkadian texts, with varying meanings and contexts. The term itself is disputed among scholars, but most translate it as something like those of royal blood or princely offspring. In the earliest texts, Anunnaki seems to refer to the great gods collectively, the offspring of An, the sky god, and Kai, the earth goddess. These were the major deities who shaped the cosmos and governed the world. In later texts, the meaning shifts slightly. Sometimes Anunnaki refers specifically to the gods of the underworld, the 7 judges who decree the fates of the dead. Sometimes it means the gods who reside on earth, as opposed to the Igigi, the gods who live in heaven. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, mentions 600 Anunnaki, 300 assigned to heaven and 300 to earth and the underworld. The number seems symbolic rather than literal, suggesting a vast divine hierarchy. But who were these gods individually? What were their personalities, their domains, their conflicts? The Sumerian pantheon was complex, with dozens of named deities and countless minor gods and goddesses. At the top stood An or Anu, the sky itself, father of the gods. But An was distant, removed from day-to-day affairs. The god who actually ran things was Enlil, lord of the air, supreme deity of the Sumerian pantheon, whose temple at Nippur was considered the religious center of all Mesopotamia. Enlil was not a kind god. He was stern, powerful, quick to anger, and absolutely dedicated to maintaining divine order. He separated heaven from earth at the beginning of creation. He controlled the winds and storms. He decreed the fates of cities and kings. When humans became too noisy, too numerous, too troublesome, it was Enlil who decided to destroy them with a great flood. He represented authority, discipline, the harsh necessities of cosmic order. His sacred number was 50, and his symbol was the horned crown that marked divine majesty. Working alongside Enlil, sometimes in cooperation and sometimes in subtle opposition, was Enki, also known by his Akkadian name Ea. Where Enlil was stern and authoritarian, Enki was clever and compassionate. He was the god of fresh water, of the subterranean ocean called the Abzu, which the Sumerians believed fed all rivers and springs. But more importantly, he was the god of wisdom, magic, crafts, and trickery. Enki loved humanity. He created us, shaped us from clay, breathed intelligence into us, and repeatedly saved us from Enlil's wrath. The goddess Ninhursag, sometimes called Nintu or Mami, was the mother goddess, the one who actually formed humans from clay mixed with divine blood. She represented fertility, birth, and the earth's productive power. She was originally An's consort before that role passed to other goddesses, and she held a position of great importance in the early pantheon. Some texts call her the mother of all gods and humans, and her role in creating humanity was central to Sumerian understanding of their own origins. Then there was Inanna, later known as Ishtar, goddess of love, sex, fertility, and war. She was Enki's daughter or niece depending on the text, and she was passionate, ambitious, and dangerous. Her myths often involve her descending to the underworld, stealing divine powers from Enki while he's drunk, or causing chaos through her romantic entanglements. She represented the unpredictable, passionate aspects of existence, both creative and destructive. Nano or Sin was the moon god, Enlil's son, who measured time and governed the calendar. Utu or Shamash was the sun god, source of light and justice. Ereshkigal ruled the underworld. Nergal was the god of plague and war. Ninurta was the warrior god and flood hero, and dozens of other deities filled specific roles in the cosmic order. Each city had its patron god who dwelt in the central temple, but all recognized the supremacy of the great Anunnaki, who governed from Nippur and the heavens above. This divine hierarchy reflected Sumerian society itself. Just as the gods had a king in Enlil, the cities had human kings who claimed divine sanction. Just as the gods had councils where they debated and decided the fates of the world, Sumerian cities had assemblies of elders. The relationship between gods and humans was understood as one of master and servant, creator and creation, but also as a kind of family relationship, with all the complexity that implies. According to the texts, the Anunnaki didn't just exist in some abstract heavenly realm. They walked the earth, dwelt in temples, ate and drank, had emotions and conflicts, made plans and carried them out. And the most important plan they ever made, according to Sumerian mythology, was the creation of humankind. But humans weren't created out of love or as some grand cosmic experiment. We were created to serve, to labor, to relieve the gods of work they found too burdensome. The story of human creation appears in several texts, but the fullest account comes from the Atrahasis epic, an Akkadian work from around 1700 BCE that drew on much older Sumerian traditions. This epic lays out the entire sequence of events, from the beginning of divine civilization to the Great Flood and beyond. It's a remarkable document, both in its scope and in what it reveals about how Mesopotamians understood their place in the cosmos. At the beginning, according to Atrahasis, the great gods, the Anunnaki, lived in a world that already existed but wasn't yet organized for agriculture or civilization. The earth was wild, uncultivated, without cities or fields. Someone needed to do the work of digging irrigation canals, planting crops, managing the rivers, building infrastructure. But who? The great gods certainly weren't going to do manual labor themselves. That would be beneath their dignity. So the labor fell to the Igigi, the lesser gods, the young gods, the divine workforce. For 40 years, some texts say 3,600 years, the Igigi dug canals, built dikes, maintained the irrigation systems that would eventually support Mesopotamian civilization. They worked without rest, without reward, growing more exhausted and resentful with each passing season. The work was backbreaking. The great gods demanded more and more. The Igigi finally reached their breaking point. The rebellion began at night. The Igigi gathered in secret, discussing their grievances. They were gods, divine beings, yet they were being treated like slaves. This was intolerable. They decided to confront Enlil directly. In the darkest hours before dawn, they surrounded Enlil's temple at Nippur, setting fire to their tools, their symbols of forced labor. They shouted and banged on the gates, demanding an audience with the Supreme Lord. Enlil woke to the sound of divine rebellion. He was terrified, according to the text, which is remarkable. The god who ruled heaven and earth was frightened by the revolt of his own subjects. He sent for Anu, his father, and for Enki, his brother. A divine council convened to address the crisis. What should be done? How could order be restored? Enlil's first instinct was harsh punishment. Find the leaders of the rebellion and execute them. Make an example that would cow the others back into submission. But Enki, always the voice of wisdom and compassion, offered a different solution. Why not create an entirely new class of beings to do the work? Beings who weren't divine, who could labor without complaint, who could be commanded without rebellion. Why not create humans? The council agreed, though not without reservations. But how would these creatures be made? What would they be made from? Here the mother goddess Ninhursag stepped forward. She knew the secret of creation, the formula for bringing life from lifeless matter. But she needed materials, divine materials. One of the gods, a lesser deity named Wielu or Geshtu-e, volunteered to be sacrificed for this purpose. His role was specific. He possessed Tiamat, intelligence or understanding. His death would give humans the spark of divine consciousness, even as they remained mortal and subservient. Wielu was killed in the assembly of the gods. His blood was collected, mixed with clay from the earth, the very soil that would need to be cultivated. Ninhursag took this mixture and began to shape it, forming the first human beings. But she didn't create just one. She created 14, 7 males and 7 females, using her divine saliva to activate the clay, speaking incantations over each form as it took shape. The creation itself was magical and mechanical at once. Some texts describe Ninhursag pinching off pieces of the clay mixture, forming them into shapes, then placing them in what sounds like an artificial womb where they would gestate for a specific period. This wasn't instantaneous divine creation, but something more like a manufacturing process, methodical and reproducible. When the first humans emerged, they were unlike anything else in creation. They had bodies like the beasts of the field, but minds touched by divinity through Wi'elu's sacrificed blood. These first humans were called to their purpose immediately. They were shown how to work the fields, how to dig the canals, how to maintain the irrigation systems that fed the great cities of the gods, and they performed these tasks willingly, or at least without the capacity to refuse. The Igigi gods were freed from their labor at last, and the Anunnaki were pleased with their solution. The great cities could now grow and prosper without divine labor. Humanity would bear that burden. But something unexpected happened. Humans, created to be servants, began to multiply. The text says we were exceedingly fertile. What started as a small workforce of 14 became hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. We spread across the land, cultivating more and more territory, building not just divine infrastructure but our own settlements. We developed culture, language, social structures. We weren't just laboring. We were living, creating, thriving. And we became noisy. This detail appears in every version of the early human story in Sumerian mythology. Humanity's noise disturbed the gods, particularly Enlil, whose rest was interrupted by our constant clamour. Some scholars interpret this literally, the sounds of human activity disturbing divine peace. Others see it as metaphorical, representing humanity's growing independence, our increasing boldness, our refusal to remain silent and subservient. Either way, we became a problem that needed solving. Enlil's solution was characteristically harsh. If humans were multiplying too quickly and becoming too troublesome, reduce their numbers. He sent a plague to devastate the population. Humans cried out to the gods for help, and Enki heard their prayers. He told the people to stop worshipping all gods and focus their prayers and offerings solely on Numtar, the plague god, essentially bribing him to withdraw the disease. The plan worked. Humanity recovered. Enlil tried again. This time he sent a drought, withholding rain, causing crops to fail and famine to spread. Again humans suffered and cried out. Again Enki intervened, this time instructing people to pray and sacrifice only to Adad, the storm god, who responded by bringing rain. Humanity was saved once more, and the population continued to grow. Enlil attempted a third solution, instituting widespread famine through some other means, perhaps locusts or crop failure. Once more Enki found a way to help, this time causing fish to swarm in the rivers and seas in such abundance that humans could sustain themselves, even without successful harvests. Each time Enlil tried to reduce the human population, Enki found a way to preserve it. Finally, Enlil lost patience with these half measures. If gradual reduction wouldn't work, complete destruction was necessary. He would send a flood, a deluge so massive that every living thing on Earth would drown. No survivors, no second chances. Humanity would be wiped out, and perhaps the gods would try again with a new creation, one more obedient and less troublesome. Or perhaps they would return to the original plan of having the Igigi do the work after all. But there was a complication. Enlil made all the gods swear an oath not to reveal the plan to humanity. If humans knew what was coming, they might prepare, might survive. The flood had to be a complete surprise. The gods gathered in council and swore their oaths. All of them, including Enki, who loved humanity more than cosmic order, who had saved humans again and again from Enlil's wrath. How could Enki honor his oath and still preserve his creation? The solution Enki devised shows why he was called the god of wisdom. He couldn't tell a human about the flood directly without breaking his oath. But there was no oath against talking to walls, so Enki went to the home of a man named Atrahasis, which means exceedingly wise, a pious man who had always honored the gods properly. Enki stood outside this man's reed house and began speaking to the wall, describing in detail the flood that was coming, explaining how it could be survived, giving specific instructions for building a boat. Atrahasis, inside his house, heard every word. The god had kept his oath technically. He had told the wall, not the man. But the message was received. Atrahasis understood that he had days, perhaps hours, to act. He began building immediately, following Enki's detailed specifications. The boat needed to be large enough to hold Atrahasis, his family, and examples of every animal species. It needed to be waterproof, sealed with bitumen. It needed to have specific dimensions to ride out the storm. Atrahasis worked with desperate speed, and his neighbors must have thought him mad, building a massive boat in the middle of dry land, talking about floods that seemed impossible. When curious neighbors asked what he was doing, Atrahasis told them a lie that Enki had provided. He was building this boat because Enlil had rejected him, and he was going to leave the city and go down to the Abzu to live with Enki in the subterranean ocean. This explanation seemed to satisfy people, or at least they didn't interfere with his strange construction project. Atrahasis gathered his family, loaded the boat with supplies and animals, and waited. The flood began exactly as Enki had warned. The sky darkened. Thunder rolled across the heavens. Rain began to fall, but not normal rain. This was a deluge, water pouring from the sky as if the heavens themselves had burst open. The rivers overflowed their banks. The canals backed up and spilled across the fields. Water rose. Higher and higher, swallowing houses, drowning livestock, pulling people under. The screaming of humanity must have been terrible, but it was soon drowned out by the roar of the flood itself. The storm raged for 7 days and 7 nights. Some texts say 6, others claim longer. Atrahasis and his family rode out the tempest in their boat, tossed by waves, surrounded by the sounds of destruction, knowing that outside their vessel the entire world was dying. Every city they had known, every person they had loved, every familiar landscape was being destroyed by divine wrath. The texts describe the violence of the flood in vivid detail, comparing it to warfare, to the screams of battle, to childbirth, to every metaphor for chaos and suffering they could imagine. And the gods themselves were horrified by what they had done. This detail is remarkable. The gods who had authorized the flood, who had agreed that humanity needed to be destroyed, were not prepared for the reality of that destruction. When the waters rose and the screaming began, the gods fled to the highest heaven, cowering like dogs against the outer walls of the cosmos. The mother goddess Ninhursag wept, lamenting that she had helped create humanity, only to see them destroyed. She cried out that the humans were her children, and now they filled the sea like the spawn of fish, drowned and lifeless. Even Ishtar, who had supported the flood plan, was overcome with grief. She swore by the lapis lazuli beads around her neck that she would never forget this tragedy. that the memory of the dead would be preserved. The gods were hungry too, because without humans there were no sacrifices, no offerings, no food prepared in the temples. They began to realize that destroying humanity meant destroying their own source of sustenance and worship. They had made a terrible mistake. When the seventh day dawned, the rain stopped. The waters began to recede. The ark came to rest on a mountain, Mount Nasir in some versions of the story. Atrahasis opened a window and looked out at a drowned world, silent and still. He released a dove, which returned because it found nowhere to land. He released a swallow, which also returned. Finally, he released a raven, which found carrion to feed on and did not come back, signaling that the waters had receded enough for life to begin again. Atrahasis disembarked and immediately built an altar and offered a sacrifice to the gods, slaughtering one of each animal and burning the meat as an offering. The gods smelled the sweet savour of the sacrifice and gathered around like flies, desperate for the food they had been denied during the flood. They were starving. They needed humanity's offerings more than they had realized. The destruction of humans had been a disaster for gods and mortals alike. Enlil arrived at the sacrifice and was furious. Humans had survived. How? Who had betrayed the plan? The gods all looked at Enki, who had always been humanity's defender. Enlil demanded an explanation. Enki defended his actions calmly. He had not technically broken his oath, and besides, destroying all humanity had been a mistake. Look how the gods suffered without human offerings. Look how Ninhursag wept for her creation. There had to be a better way to manage the human population. A compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but measures would be put in place to prevent overpopulation from becoming a problem again. The Mother Goddess, with Enki's help, instituted what amounted to population control measures. Some women would be infertile, some babies would not survive childbirth, some priestesses would be required to remain celibate. Additionally, human lifespans, which had been tremendously long before the flood, would be drastically reduced. Death would claim humans far more quickly than it had before. Atrahasis himself was rewarded for his faithfulness. Along with his wife, he was granted immortality and taken to dwell at the mouth of the rivers in the faraway place where the Tigris and Euphrates flowed into the sea. He became something like a demigod, a human who had transcended mortality through divine favor. His story would be remembered and retold for thousands of years, incorporated into other epics, influencing other cultures' flood narratives. The survivors of the flood, Atrahasis' family and descendants, repopulated the earth. They rebuilt cities, re-established agriculture, reinstituted the worship of the gods. But things were different now. The relationship between humanity and the divine had changed. Before the flood, humans were simply servants, tools created for a purpose. After the flood, there was a sense of covenant, of mutual dependence. The gods needed humanity's worship and offerings. Humans needed divine favor and protection. It was a relationship of exchange, still unequal but more reciprocal than before. The establishment of cities and kingship came next. The gods decided that humanity needed structure, governance, divine sanction for authority. Kingship was lowered from heaven to the city of Eridu first, according to the Sumerian king list. The first kings reigned for impossibly long periods, thousands of years, suggesting they were semi-divine, or perhaps the numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals. After the flood, the king list says, kingship descended from heaven, again, this time to the city of Kish, and the reigns became more realistic in length. These early kings were understood to be chosen by the gods, ruling with divine mandate. They weren't gods themselves, with a few exceptions, but they were the intermediaries between heaven and earth, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order, building and maintaining temples, ensuring justice, protecting their cities from enemies, and organizing the labor necessary to maintain the irrigation systems that kept civilization alive. The institution of kingship was deeply tied to the temples and priesthood. In early Sumerian society, the distinction between king and high priest was often unclear. The temple complexes were both religious and economic centers, managing vast estates, directing agricultural production, storing grain surpluses, and organizing craft production. The king's palace and the god's temple were the twin pillars of urban life. Life after the Anunnaki's arrival, after human creation, after the flood and the re-establishment of society, became what we recognize as Sumerian civilization. The gods had created humans to work, and work we did, but we also developed art, literature, law, science, and philosophy. We weren't just slaves grinding away at divine commands. We built something magnificent. Consider the city of Uruk at its height around 3000 BCE. It covered over 2 square miles, protected by massive walls that tradition attributed to Gilgamesh himself. At the center stood 2 great temple complexes, one dedicated to Anu and the other to Inanna. These weren't simple shrines, but massive architectural achievements. The White Temple stood on a ziggurat 40 feet high, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the sun, visible for miles across the flat plains. Inside, priests performed daily rituals, making offerings to maintain cosmic order. The city had distinct neighborhoods: the temple district with its priests and administrative workers, the market quarter where merchants traded goods from across the known world, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, cedar from Lebanon. The residential areas where craftspeople lived and worked: potters, weavers, metalworkers, each with their own guilds and specializations. The streets were narrow and winding, houses built of mud brick, often 2 stories tall with courtyards in the center. People lived structured lives. The day began at dawn with prayers and offerings to household gods. Men went to work in the fields or workshops. Women managed households, though some also worked as priestesses, brewers, or textile workers. Children played in the streets and began learning their parents' trades from an early age. Scribes attended school in the Adaba, the tablet house, learning the hundreds of signs that made up cuneiform writing. Writing itself was a gift that had divine origins. Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom, was said to have taught humans this art, though in practice it developed gradually from simple record-keeping to complex literature. The earliest tablets are purely functional lists and receipts, but by 2500 BCE, scribes were composing hymns, prayers, myths, proverbs, and wisdom literature. The most famous Sumerian literary works date from this period. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though it exists in its fullest form in a later Akkadian version, originated in Sumerian poems about the legendary king of Uruk. These early poems told of Gilgamesh's adventures with his friend Enkidu, his quest for immortality after Enkidu's death, and his eventual acceptance of human mortality. The epic engages with profound questions. What does it mean to be human? How should we face death? What is the relationship between civilization and wilderness? What responsibilities do rulers have? Other literary works included hymns to various gods, lamentations over destroyed cities, wisdom literature instructing young scribes in proper behavior, and myths explaining natural phenomena. The Descent of Inanna told how the goddess traveled to the underworld and was killed by her sister Ereshkigal, only to be rescued through Enki's trickery. Enki and Ninhursag related various creation stories and divine conflicts. The Curse of Agard explained why the city of Akkad was destroyed by divine wrath. These texts weren't just entertainment, they served as moral instruction, religious education, and cultural preservation. They were copied and recopied by generations of scribes, with each copy potentially introducing small variations. Through this process of transmission, the stories evolved while maintaining their core elements. When later cultures, the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, conquered and absorbed Sumerian territories, They adopted these myths and adapted them to their own languages and theological frameworks. The transition from Sumerian to Akkadian dominance happened gradually over centuries. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue unrelated to Sumerian, had always been spoken by some groups in Mesopotamia. Around 2300 BCE, Sargon of Akkad united much of Mesopotamia under his rule, creating the first known empire in history. Sargon was not Sumerian but Akkadian, and he promoted his language and culture. Yet Sargon also honored Sumerian traditions. He appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of Nanna at Ur, and she became one of history's first named authors, composing hymns in both Sumerian and Akkadian. She wrote passionate poems to Inanna, complex theological texts exploring the goddess's power, and political propaganda supporting her father's regime. Her work shows how Sumerian and Akkadian cultures were blending, creating a hybrid civilization that would endure for millennia. The myths adapted too. The Akkadians adopted the Sumerian pantheon, but gave the gods new names. Anu remained Anu, but Enlil sometimes became Elil, Enki became Ea, Inanna became Ishtar, Nanna became Sin, Utu became Shamash. The myths themselves were translated and sometimes modified. New gods entered the pantheon, most notably Marduk, who would eventually replace Enlil as the supreme deity in Babylonian theology. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, represents this theological shift. Dating to the late 2nd millennium BCE, though possibly based on older materials, it tells a story of cosmic conflict and divine hierarchy that both echoes and transforms the older Sumerian myths. In this version, the universe begins with two primordial entities, Apsu, the fresh, water, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, representing male and female principles, chaos, and potential. From the mingling of their waters, other gods are born, including Anu and Ea. These younger gods are noisy and disturbing, annoying Apsu, who decides to destroy them. Ea, clever as always, discovers the plot and strikes first, killing Apsu and taking over his domain, the fresh waters beneath the earth. Ea settles in this realm, marries Damkina, and fathers a son, Marduk, who is described as perfect in every way, with 4 eyes that see everything and 4 ears that hear all. Tiamat, enraged by Apsu's death, creates an army of monsters to avenge him. She appoints King, one of her offspring, as commander and gives him the Tablet of Destinies, which grants the power to decree fates. The younger gods are terrified. None of them dare face Tiamat in battle. Not Anu, not Ea, none of the great powers of the early pantheon, but Marduk, young and ambitious, offers to fight Tiamat on one condition. If he succeeds, he must be made supreme king of the gods. The gods agree. They have no choice. Marduk arms himself with powerful weapons, the 7 winds, a flood storm, a lightning bolt, a net woven by the gods. He faces Tiamat in single combat. When she opens her mouth to devour him, he sends the winds into her belly, inflating her so she cannot close her jaws. Then he shoots an arrow down her throat, piercing her heart and killing her. He captures King and takes the Tablet of Destinies for himself. Then comes the act of creation. Marduk splits Tiamat's corpse in half, using one half to create the dome of heaven and the other to form the earth. From her eyes flow the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From her breasts arise mountains. He arranges the stars and constellations, sets the moon and sun in their courses, establishes the calendar and seasons. He's reorganizing chaos into cosmos, creating order from Tiamat's defeated body. Finally, Marduk proposes creating humans to serve the gods. He asks which of Tiamat's army was responsible for the rebellion. The gods identify Kingu, who is executed. From King's blood mixed with earth, Ea creates humanity. We are made from the blood of a rebel god, which explains our troublesome nature in Babylonian theology. We are created to perform the labor that the gods no longer wish to do, exactly as in the earlier Sumerian accounts. But now there's an added element: we carry rebellion in our very blood. The Enuma Elish served as the foundation myth for Babylonian civilization, explaining not just cosmic origins but also political realities. Marduk's supremacy reflected Babylon's rise to political dominance. The epic was recited during the New Year festival, the Akitu, in a ritual that renewed creation and reaffirmed the king's divine mandate. The festival lasted 12 days and involved processions, purification rituals, symbolic combats, and a sacred marriage ceremony. It was the high point of Babylonian religious life. But even as Babylon rose and Babylonian theology elevated Marduk to supreme status, the older Sumerian traditions persisted. Scribes continued to copy Sumerian texts. Priests learned Sumerian as a liturgical language, much as Latin was used in medieval Christianity. The myths of Enlil, Enki, and the other Anunnaki remained foundational to Mesopotamian culture. The flood story in particular was retold endlessly. The Sumerian version with Ziusudra, the Akkadian Atrahasis, the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, which incorporates the flood as a story within a story, all these versions circulated and influenced each other. When Hebrew scribes composed Genesis, they drew on Mesopotamian flood traditions, creating the story of Noah that would become the most famous flood narrative in Western culture. The parallels are too close to be coincidental. A righteous man warned by a god, instructions to build an ark, animals saved in pairs, a dove sent out to find land, a sacrifice offered after the waters recede. But there are important differences too. In Genesis, one God is responsible for both sending the flood and saving Noah. There's no conflict between different deities. The reason for the flood is human sin, not overpopulation or noise, and the focus is on moral righteousness rather than just ritual piety. These changes reflect the theological concerns of Hebrew monotheism, but the basic story structure comes from Mesopotamia, preserved in texts that were old when Genesis was being composed. Other Mesopotamian myths influenced biblical narratives as well. The Garden of Eden story echoes Sumerian myths about Dilmun, a paradise where there is no sickness or death. The Tower of Babel story reflects Mesopotamian ziggurat construction and concerns about divine human boundaries. The creation of humans from earth appears in both traditions. These parallels don't necessarily mean direct copying. Some could be independent developments from shared cultural contexts, but they show how deeply Mesopotamian mythology influenced the wider ancient Near East. Life in Mesopotamia after the Anunnaki's establishment of civilization continued for thousands of years with remarkable continuity. Cities rose and fell, empires conquered and crumbled. Languages shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian to Aramaic. Rulers came from different ethnic groups: Sumerians, Akkadians, Amorites, Kassites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians. But the fundamental patterns of urban life, the irrigation agriculture, the temple economies, the cuneiform writing, the mythological traditions, all these persisted. The great cities of Mesopotamia became legendary. Babylon, with its towering ziggurat that may have inspired the Tower of Babel story, its hanging gardens which may have been real or mythical, its massive walls and impressive gates. Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, whose royal library preserved thousands of tablets, including the most complete version of the Gilgamesh epic we possess. Whose ziggurat still stands partially today, whose royal tombs yielded incredible treasures. These cities were marvels of the ancient world. But they were also vulnerable. The irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian civilization possible required constant maintenance. Neglect them for even a short time and canals would silt up, fields would become waterlogged and saline, crops would fail. Political instability often led to agricultural collapse, which led to famine, which led to more instability. It was a fragile system, always balanced on the edge of disaster. Eventually, the great Mesopotamian civilizations did fall. The Assyrian Empire collapsed in the 7th century BCE, destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The Babylonian Empire that replaced it lasted less than a century before Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamian culture continued but increasingly blended with Persian and later Greek influences. When Alexander the Great conquered the region in 331 BCE, Hellenistic culture began to dominate. The cuneiform writing system, which had preserved Sumerian and Akkadian texts for 3 millennia, gradually fell out of use. The last known cuneiform text dates to 75 CE, an astronomical tablet. After that, the knowledge of how to read cuneiform was lost. The myths of the Anunnaki, the stories of Enlil and Enki, the Epic of Gilgamesh, all these became forgotten, buried under millennia of desert sand and the ruins of fallen cities. They remained forgotten until the 19th century, when archaeologists began excavating the mounds of Mesopotamia. The first major discoveries came from Nineveh, where Austin Henry Layard uncovered the Palace of Sennacherib and later the Library of Ashurbanipal. This library contained thousands of tablets, including multiple copies of the Gilgamesh epic, the Enuma Elish, and many other literary works. In 1872, George Smith, working at the British Museum, deciphered the flood story from the Gilgamesh tablets and recognized its similarity to the biblical flood narrative. His announcement caused a sensation. Other sites yielded more treasures. Excavations at Ur revealed the famous royal tombs with their gold and lapis lazuli treasures. Digs at Nippur uncovered thousands of tablets, many of them Sumerian literary texts. Slowly, painstakingly, scholars learned to read cuneiform, first the simpler Akkadian, then the more complex Sumerian. They compiled dictionaries, grammars, and catalogues of texts. They debated meanings, compared versions, reconstructed damaged tablets. The picture that emerged was astonishing. Here was a sophisticated literature, legal codes, scientific and mathematical texts, historical records, all from a civilization that had been completely forgotten. The Sumerians, who had invented writing and urban civilization, who had created works of art and literature of surprising power and beauty, became known again. Their myths and legends could be read in the original languages. Their gods, the Anunnaki, emerged from obscurity. But with this rediscovery came misunderstanding and sensationalism. In the 1970s, Zecharia Sitchin published a series of books claiming that the Anunnaki were not gods but ancient astronauts, aliens from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth to mine gold and genetically engineered humans to serve as a slave labor force. Sitchin claimed to be translating Sumerian texts, but professional scholars pointed out that his translations were wildly inaccurate, cherry-picking phrases, mistranslating words, and inventing meanings that had no basis in the actual texts. Despite being thoroughly debunked by experts in Sumerian language and literature, Sitchin's ideas gained popular traction. They appealed to people who wanted ancient mysteries and exotic explanations for human origins. They fit into a broader pattern of ancient astronaut theories that denied ancient peoples the credit for their own achievements. Instead of recognizing the Sumerians as brilliant innovators who developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature, Sitchin's narrative attributed these achievements to alien intervention. This does a disservice to the actual Sumerian texts, which are far more interesting and sophisticated than Sitchin's reductionist readings suggest. The myths of the Anunnaki aren't crude accounts of alien visitors, but complex theological and philosophical explorations of existence, suffering, mortality, duty, and the relationship between the human and divine. They grapple with profound questions. Why do we suffer? Why must we die? What is our purpose? How should we live? What responsibilities do we have to each other and to the divine? The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic isn't just about making slaves. It's about the nature of work and society, about the conflicts between authority and compassion, about how civilizations balance competing needs. Consider what the texts actually say. Humans are created from clay and divine blood, from earth and heaven mixed together. We are both material and spiritual, mortal and yet touched by divinity. We are made to work, yes, but work isn't presented as merely drudgery. Agricultural labour, irrigation, building. These activities transform wilderness into civilization. They create order from chaos. In a sense, humans continue the creative work of the gods, shaping the earth into something habitable and productive. The conflict between Enlil and Enki over humanity's fate reflects different aspects of divine nature and perhaps different aspects of human experience. Enlil represents order, law, discipline, the harsh necessities of maintaining civilization. Enki represents wisdom, compassion, creativity, the impulse to preserve life even when it's troublesome. Neither is purely good or evil, both are necessary, and humans, caught between these competing divine impulses, must navigate a world that is both ordered and chaotic, ruled by law, but also dependent on mercy. The flood story operates on multiple levels. On one level, it's an etiological myth explaining why humans die young, why childbirth is dangerous, why some women are infertile, natural phenomena that ancient people needed to explain. On another level, it's a moral tale about divine justice and mercy, about the consequences of angering the gods, but also about divine compassion. On yet another level, it may preserve folk memories of actual catastrophic floods that occurred in Mesopotamian history, events so traumatic they were incorporated into the mythological framework. Archaeological evidence does suggest that major floods occurred in Mesopotamia in the early 3rd millennium BCE. Excavations at Ur revealed a thick layer of water-deposited clay, separating older occupation levels from newer ones. Similar flood layers have been found at other sites. These floods weren't worldwide, the geological evidence rules that out, but they may have seemed universal to people whose entire known world was the river valleys of Mesopotamia. A flood that destroyed every city they knew about might well be remembered as a flood that destroyed the world. The historical Atrahasis, if he existed, might have been a ruler who successfully prepared for and survived such a flood, perhaps by building grain stores or organizing refugees, actions that became mythologized over generations into the story of building an ark. Or the story might be entirely mythical, a way of explaining humanity's survival through catastrophes, attributing it to divine favor and human wisdom working together. What matters for understanding what happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to Sumerian texts, isn't whether the stories are literally historically accurate. What matters is what they reveal about how the Sumerians understood their world, their history, and their relationship to the divine. They saw themselves as created by the gods for a purpose, yes, but also as participants in an ongoing story of civilization building. They weren't passive servants, but active agents who developed agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature. The gifts of civilization were attributed to divine sources. Enki gave humans knowledge of farming, fishing, metalworking, and magic. He established the Emmi, the fundamental principles that governed all aspects of civilization, from kingship to music to sexual intercourse. Inanna famously stole many of these Mi from Enki while he was drunk, bringing them to her city Uruk, which is why Uruk became a great center of culture and power. These stories encode the idea that civilization is divine in origin, that culture and technology are sacred gifts that should be honored and preserved. The temples served as centers for preserving and transmitting this knowledge. Scribal schools trained generations of young men, and occasionally women, in the art of cuneiform writing. Mathematical texts taught complex calculations needed for surveying fields, calculating grain stores, and planning irrigation projects. Astronomical tablets recorded the movements of stars and planets, developing predictive models for eclipses and planetary conjunctions. Medical texts catalogued diseases and treatments. Legal text preserved law codes and court decisions. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to around 1750 BCE, is the most famous Mesopotamian legal document, but it's part of a long tradition of law codes going back to the Sumerian or Namu code from 2100 BCE and probably earlier unpreserved examples. These codes show sophisticated legal thinking, distinguishing between different types of offences, calibrating punishments to crimes, protecting the rights of women and children at least to some degree, and establishing the principle that justice should be public, codified, and consistent. The astronomical knowledge developed in Mesopotamia was particularly impressive. Babylonian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They developed a sophisticated mathematical astronomy that influenced Greek and later Islamic and European science. The zodiac, the division of the sky into 12 constellations through which the sun appears to move, originated in Babylonian astronomy. The 7-day week derives from the observation that there are 7 visible celestial bodies that move against the background of stars, the sun, moon, and 5 planets known to ancient astronomers. Mathematics in Mesopotamia used a base 60 counting system, which is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds, why circles have 360 degrees. Babylonian mathematicians could solve quadratic equations, calculate square roots and cube roots, work with Pythagorean triples, and handle complex problems in geometry and algebra. Mathematical texts were used both for practical applications like surveying and for teaching, with many tablets presenting problems and solutions in a format similar to modern textbooks. All of this knowledge, this sophisticated intellectual culture, was understood as existing within a framework established by the gods. The Anunnaki had created the world, created humans, established the principles of civilization, and continued to oversee and interact with human affairs. Kings claimed divine mandate. Laws were understood as reflecting divine will. Temples served as the link between heaven and earth. The cosmic order, the me that Enki guarded and Inanna stole, was the foundation of all civilized life. What happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to Sumerian texts, was the emergence of everything that made life meaningful. Not just biological existence, but culture, law, art, knowledge, community. The gods gave humans the capacity to labor, yes, but also the capacity to think, create, love, worship, and build. We were created to serve, but in serving we became something more than the gods initially intended. We became civilized, a word that derives from civis, city, but that in Sumerian terms meant participating in the cosmic order established by the divine powers. The relationship between humans and gods in Mesopotamian thought was never simple or one-dimensional. Gods were powerful, but not omnipotent. They could be capricious, angry, jealous, but also compassionate, wise, and protective. They needed humans as much as humans needed them. Without human worship and offerings, the gods would starve, as they did during the flood. This mutual dependence created a kind of covenant, though not in the biblical sense of a formal agreement. Rather, it was an understood relationship of reciprocal obligations. Humans provided worship, offerings, temple maintenance, and obedience to divine will. Gods provided protection, fertility, victory in war, just rule, and the continuation of cosmic order. When either side failed in their obligations, disaster could result. If humans grew too proud or neglected the gods, divine punishment might follow. If gods were unjust or cruel, they might face rebellion from other gods or lose their worshippers' devotion. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores this relationship in profound ways. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, possesses godlike strength and ambition but is ultimately mortal. His best friend Enkidu is created by the gods to challenge Gilgamesh but becomes his companion instead. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is confronted with the inevitability of his own death despite his semi-divine nature. He journeys to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted immortality, seeking the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the flood story, explaining how he gained immortality, but makes clear that this was a unique occurrence that cannot be repeated. The gods will not grant immortality to Gilgamesh no matter how great his deeds. However, Utnapishtim does tell Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth. Gilgamesh retrieves this plant after a difficult underwater journey, but on his way home while bathing in a pool, a serpent steals the plant and eats it, immediately shedding its skin and becoming young again. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, having failed in his quest for immortality. But he has gained wisdom. He looks at the great walls of Uruk, the city he built, and realizes that this is his immortality, not personal eternal life, but the legacy of his works, the civilization he helped create. The text ends with a kind of acceptance of mortality, not as a defeat, but as a recognition of what it means to be human. We die, yes, but we can create things that outlast us. We can build cities, write poems, establish laws, leave a legacy. This conclusion resonates with the broader Mesopotamian worldview. Life is finite, often difficult, filled with suffering and uncertainty. The gods are powerful but capricious. Death comes to all, and the afterlife, the underworld ruled by Ereshkigal, is a gloomy place where the dead exist as shadows, eating dust and clay. There is no heavenly reward for the righteous, no punishment for the wicked beyond what befalls them in life. Justice must be done on earth, because there is no cosmic balance that will be restored after death. Given this worldview, what matters is how one lives, the relationships one builds, the work one accomplishes, the reputation one earns. The Mesopotamian conception of the afterlife emphasized the importance of being remembered. To be forgotten after death was a kind of second death, a complete annihilation. To be remembered in songs and stories, to have one's name preserved in inscriptions, to leave behind children and works, this was the only immortality humans could hope for. This may seem bleak to modern sensibilities shaped by religions that promise eternal life, but it also has a certain nobility. It places tremendous emphasis on moral action in the present, on building a just society, on creating beauty and knowledge, on fulfilling one's responsibilities to family and community. You cannot defer virtue to gain a heavenly reward. You must be just, compassionate, wise, and generous now, in this life, because this is all there is. The Anunnaki in this framework were not distant, abstract deities, but active participants in human affairs. They could be pleased or angered by human behavior. They could intervene in history, choosing kings, destroying cities, sending plagues or prosperity. But they were not all-knowing or all-powerful. They made mistakes, as the flood story shows. They had conflicts among themselves. They could be deceived, as Enki deceived Enlil to save humanity. They were, in many ways, like humans writ large, possessing human emotions and flaws but on a cosmic scale. This anthropomorphic quality of Mesopotamian deities has sometimes been criticized as primitive compared to more abstract conceptions of divinity in later religions, but it also made the gods relatable, comprehensible to ordinary worshippers. You could understand why Enlil was angry about noise because you yourself had been kept awake by loud neighbors. You could sympathize with Inanna's jealousy because you had experienced similar emotions. You could appreciate Enki's cleverness because you valued wisdom and cunning yourself. The temple rituals maintained the relationship between humans and gods on a daily basis. Every morning, priests would wake the divine statues, wash and dress them, offer them meals of bread, beer, meat, and fruit. Musicians would play hymns, incense would be burned. The routine was elaborate and precisely defined, because the gods were understood to actually dwell in their statues, and those statues needed to be cared for properly. The statues themselves were crafted with great skill from valuable materials, cedarwood, gold, lapis lazuli, imported from distant lands at great expense. The making of a divine statue was a sacred act. accompanied by rituals that transferred divine presence into the crafted object. Once consecrated, the statue was the god, not just a representation, but an actual embodiment. To damage or destroy a divine statue was to attack the god themselves, which is why conquering armies would often carry off defeated cities' divine statues, demonstrating that they had captured the gods along with the territory. The temple economies were complex systems managing agricultural land, livestock, workshops, and trade. Thousands of people worked for the temples as farmers, shepherds, craftspeople, merchants, and administrators. The temples paid wages in barley rations and wool, maintained storehouses for emergencies, and redistributed wealth to some degree. They were not exactly charitable institutions, but they did provide employment and a safety net for at least some of the population. The creation of this temple system, this entire structure of Mesopotamian urban civilization, was attributed to divine instruction following the flood. The gods had destroyed the old world, and then worked with humanity to build the new world according to divine principles. The me that governed civilization covered everything from farming techniques to sexual practices to political authority. They were the operating instructions for civilization, the software that made the hardware of human society function properly. Different cities claimed to possess different me, which reflected their economic specializations and political importance. Uruk had the me of kingship and warfare, partly because of Inanna's theft from Enki. Eridu had the me of wisdom and magic, as the city of Enki. Nippur had the me of religious authority, as Enlil's city. Ur had the me of commerce and mathematics, as the city of the moon god Nanna, who measured time. Each city's patron deity granted it particular strengths and responsibilities within the larger cosmic order. Wars between cities were understood as conflicts between their patron deities, fought through human agents. When one city conquered another, it meant that city's god had proven stronger, but the defeated god wasn't destroyed, just subordinated. The victorious city would often incorporate the defeated city's deity into their pantheon at a lower rank. This theological flexibility allowed Mesopotamian religion to adapt to changing political realities while maintaining continuity. The Akkadian conquest of Sumer around 2300 BCE didn't destroy Sumerian religion, but adapted it. The Sumerian gods remained in the pantheon with Akkadian names. The myths were translated and continued. The theological framework persisted. Similarly, when the Amorites established the Babylonian kingdom around 1800 BCE, they adopted Mesopotamian gods and myths while elevating Marduk, originally a relatively minor deity, to supreme status. This process of theological adaptation and innovation continued throughout Mesopotamian history. Gods rose and fell in importance depending on the political fortunes of their cities. New gods entered the pantheon as foreign peoples were incorporated into Mesopotamian culture. Theological concepts evolved as priests and scholars debated the nature of the divine and the meaning of ancient texts. But the core mythology, the stories of the Anunnaki, remained central. Enki and Enlil continued to represent different divine attributes and approaches to governing the world. The creation of humanity from clay and divine blood continued to explain human nature as both earthly and touched by divinity. The flood story continued to teach lessons about divine power, human vulnerability, and the importance of wisdom and piety. The quest for immortality, as explored in Gilgamesh, continued to resonate with people who faced their own mortality. These myths were not just ancient stories, but living traditions that shaped how people understood their world. When a farmer dug an irrigation canal, he participated in the work the Agigi gods had once done and humans were created to do. When a king administered justice, he fulfilled the divine mandate granted to rulers. When a scribe copied a tablet, he preserved the knowledge that the gods had given humanity. Every aspect of civilized life was embedded in this mythological framework. The texts themselves were considered sacred. not in the sense of being inerrant divine revelation, but as precious repositories of divine wisdom and cultural memory. Tablets were stored in temple and palace libraries, catalogued and cared for. When tablets became too damaged to read, they were copied onto new tablets, though copyists sometimes introduced errors or variations. Comparing different versions of the same text, which modern scholars do routinely, shows how myths evolved over time while maintaining their essential elements. The discovery and decipherment of these texts in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed to the modern world a literature that had been lost for nearly 2 millennia. Reading the Atrahasis epic or the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh in the original languages, or even in careful modern translations, gives us direct access to how ancient Mesopotamians thought about the most fundamental questions of existence. These are not primitive mythmakers, but sophisticated thinkers grappling with timeless problems. What happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to the actual Sumerian and Akkadian texts rather than sensationalized modern reinterpretations, was the emergence of a complex civilization that lasted for 3,000 years. The gods created humans to work, and humans did work, transforming the river valleys of Mesopotamia into productive, agricultural land, building the first cities, inventing writing, developing mathematics and astronomy, creating sophisticated legal and political systems, and producing remarkable works of art and literature. This civilization wasn't perfect. It was marked by warfare, slavery, social inequality, and environmental degradation from over-irrigation. The texts themselves don't shy away from acknowledging the harshness of life, the arbitrariness of divine favor, the inevitability of death. But within those constraints, the Mesopotamians built something extraordinary. They asked profound questions and offered answers that still resonate today, even if we no longer worship Enlil or Enki. The relationship between the human and the divine, as understood in Mesopotamian mythology, was one of mutual dependence but fundamental inequality. Gods were stronger, longer-lived, and held the power to decree fates. But they also needed humans. Without our labor, the earth would return to wilderness. Without our worship, the gods would go hungry. This mutual need created a kind of cosmic balance, unstable and frequently disrupted, but ultimately sustainable across millennia. Modern scholarship has revealed that Mesopotamian mythology influenced many later traditions. The flood story appears not just in Genesis, but in traditions throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. The concept of cosmic law, or divine order, influenced Greek philosophy. Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge was transmitted to Greek and later Islamic scientists. Mathematical techniques developed in Babylon were adopted by cultures around the world. But we don't need to trace every influence to appreciate these texts on their own terms. They stand as remarkable achievements of human creativity and wisdom. The Sumerians, looking at the same stars we see, the same rivers, the same fertile plains that supported their civilization, asked where it all came from and what it all meant. Their answer was the mythology of the Anunnaki, gods who created the world and humanity, who maintained cosmic order despite conflicts among themselves, who flooded the earth and then established civilization anew. Whether we interpret these myths as literal history, as encoded astronomical knowledge, as political propaganda, as moral instruction, or as sophisticated theological philosophy, they remain valuable windows into the minds of people who lived thousands of years ago. They show us that ancient people were not so different from us. They feared death, loved their children, valued wisdom and justice, created beauty, and sought meaning in a world they could not fully control or understand. The Anunnaki, as portrayed in the texts, were not alien overlords, but divine archetypes representing different aspects of existence. Enlil was order and authority, necessary but harsh. Enki was wisdom and compassion, creative but sometimes subversive of order. Ninhursag was life and fertility, nurturing but also finite. Inanna was passion and power, energizing but dangerous. Each god embodied particular forces, and together they maintained the balance that allowed civilization to exist. Understanding what happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth means understanding this entire framework, not reducing it to simplistic alien visitor stories or dismissing it as primitive superstition. The Sumerian texts reveal a sophisticated understanding of the human condition, our place in the cosmos, our relationship to nature and to each other. They show us how one of humanity's earliest civilizations made sense of their world and passed that understanding down through generations. The physical tablets that preserve these stories are themselves remarkable artifacts. Some are small, fitting in the palm of your hand, inscribed with tiny cuneiform signs. Others are large, heavy objects requiring both hands to lift. Some are pristine, with clear, legible text. Others are fragmentary, broken by the weight of millennia, requiring painstaking reconstruction to read. Each represents hours of work by an ancient scribe, carefully pressing a reed stylus into soft clay, forming each wedge-shaped sign with practiced precision. These scribes probably didn't imagine that their work would be read thousands of years later by people speaking languages they never heard of, living in places they never knew existed. They were doing their jobs, copying text for their temple libraries, creating fresh copies to replace worn-out tablets, sometimes adding their own colophons, identifying themselves and explaining when and why they made the copy. I, Nabuzukup-Kenu, scribe of Sippar, wrote this tablet in the month of Nisan, for my own learning and for the preservation of knowledge. Such colophons give us glimpses of individual people, reaching across millennia. When we read these texts today, whether in museum collections, university libraries, or online databases, we are part of a chain of transmission that stretches back to the earliest days of writing. The stories of Enki and Enlil, the creation of humanity, the Great Flood, the quest for immortality, these narratives have survived the fall of empires, the extinction of languages, the destruction of cities, the loss of entire civilizations. They survived because people, generation after generation, considered them worth preserving, worth copying, worth passing on. In a sense, this is the ultimate answer to what happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to Sumerian texts. What happened was memory. Human beings developed the capacity not just to live in the present, but to preserve the past and imagine the future. Writing allowed experiences, stories, and knowledge to transcend individual lifetimes. A scribe in Uruk could read the same poem that had been composed in Nippur centuries earlier. A priest in Babylon could perform rituals based on texts from Sumerian times. And we, today, can read these stories and connect with the thoughts and beliefs of people who lived 5,000 years ago. This continuity of tradition, this preservation of cultural memory, was itself a divine gift according to Mesopotamian thought. Nabu, god of writing and wisdom, son of Marduk, was the patron of scribes. To write was to participate in divine activity, to preserve the me, to maintain civilization against the forces of chaos and forgetfulness. Every copied tablet was an act of cosmic maintenance, keeping the world ordered and the past alive. The great library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh contained over 30,000 tablets, collected from across the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal, king in the 7th century BCE, was himself a literate man, unusual for a monarch, and he took pride in his library. His colophon appears on many tablets. I, Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria, on whom Nabu and Tashmetu bestowed broad understanding and deep insight, who mastered the scribble art completely, who learned the wisdom of Nabu. He saw his library as securing his own immortality, preserving his name and his glory. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, the palace burned. But many of the clay tablets, rather than being destroyed by the fire, were baked hard, preserving them for modern archaeologists to discover 2,500 years later. This accidental preservation gave us the most complete versions of many Mesopotamian texts, including Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, and the Enuma Elish. The irony is profound. The destruction of the library ensured the survival of its contents. The final centuries of cuneiform culture saw Mesopotamian civilization under foreign rule, first Persian, then Greek, then Parthian. The old cities declined. Babylon was gradually abandoned. The irrigation systems neglected silted up. Fields that had fed hundreds of thousands became salt-encrusted wastelands. The great temples fell into ruin. The old gods were forgotten, replaced by new deities, Ahura Mazda of the Persians, Zeus and the Olympians of the Greeks, eventually Christ and Allah. But even as Mesopotamian civilization ended, its influences persisted. Greek astronomers learned from Babylonian star catalogues. Jewish rabbis incorporated Mesopotamian myths into biblical commentaries. Islamic scholars translated mathematical and astronomical texts. The zodiac, the 7-day week, the division of circles into 360 degrees, the base 60 counting system still used for time measurement, all these Mesopotamian innovations became fundamental to later civilizations. The myths themselves, even when no longer believed, continued to influence storytelling traditions. The Divine Council, gods debating the fate of mortals, appears in traditions from Norse mythology to Christian angelology. The flood hero appears in stories from Greece to India. The quest for immortality, the friendship between civilized and wild men, the descent to the underworld. These narrative patterns established in Mesopotamian literature recur throughout world mythology and literature. So what happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth? According to Sumerian texts, civilization happened. Agriculture, cities, writing, law, mathematics, astronomy, literature, all the foundations of complex society emerged in the land between the rivers under the governance of the great gods. Humans were created to serve, but in serving we became creators ourselves, building on the divine template to develop our own innovations and traditions. The texts tell us that this process was neither smooth nor inevitable. The gods made mistakes. They destroyed humanity and then regretted it. They fought among themselves. They were capricious and sometimes cruel. But they also gave humans tremendous gifts: intelligence, the capacity for culture, the ability to transform the world through labor and wisdom. And through it all, through flood and famine, war and peace, the rise and fall of cities and empires, humanity persisted, preserving memory, creating meaning, building civilization. The Sumerian scribes who first wrote these stories down couldn't have imagined a world where their cities would be ruins, their language dead, their gods forgotten. But they knew that memory was sacred, that knowledge needed to be preserved, that the stories of how the world came to be and how humans came to be civilized were worth the labor of pressing signs into clay. They were right. Those clay tablets outlasted bronze, outlasted empires, outlasted the civilization that created them. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Atrahasis epic or the Enuma Elish today, we are doing what those scribes hoped someone would do. We are remembering. We are preserving the past. We are making meaning from ancient words. In a very real sense, we are continuing the work that the Anunnaki began when they created humanity. The work of maintaining civilization, preserving knowledge, creating order from chaos. The actual Sumerian texts, freed from alien astronaut nonsense and read in their proper historical and cultural context, are far more interesting than any sensationalized reinterpretation. They show us a sophisticated civilization grappling with the fundamental questions of existence. They reveal complex theological ideas about the nature of divinity, the meaning of creation, the problem of suffering, and the inevitability of death. They demonstrate that ancient people were not primitive or credulous, but thoughtful, creative, and deeply concerned with understanding their world. The Anunnaki were not aliens. They were the divine powers as understood by one of humanity's first great civilizations. They represented the forces that governed the cosmos, the sky and earth and water, the sun and moon, fertility and warfare, wisdom and order. They were the explanation for why the world was the way it was, why humans suffered and died, why some were powerful and others weak, why civilization existed with all its benefits and burdens. This theological framework served Mesopotamian society for 3,000 years, adapting as political circumstances changed, incorporating new ideas as cultures mixed, but maintaining its core elements. It provided a shared understanding of the world that made cooperation possible. It sanctioned laws and supported rulers. It explained natural phenomena and gave meaning to human existence. It created a rich literary and intellectual tradition that influenced civilizations throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. When we ask what happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, we're really asking what it means to be civilized, what it costs to maintain order, what we owe to each other and to the forces beyond our control. The Sumerian answer, preserved in texts that survived millennia, is complex and not entirely comforting. We're created to serve, but service can be meaningful. We must labor, but labor can transform wilderness into gardens. We will die, but we can leave behind works that outlast us. The gods are powerful, but not always just, which means we must create justice ourselves. These are not simple myths for simple people. They are profound meditations on the human condition, created by people who built one of history's great civilizations with nothing more than mud bricks, human ingenuity, and the waters of 2 rivers. They looked at the stars and imagined the gods who created them. They looked at the earth and imagined how it came to be separated from heaven. They looked at their cities and imagined divine blueprints. They looked at their own mortality and imagined the flood that once destroyed and the wisdom that preserved. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the actual Sumerian texts, rather than in modern misinterpretations, were divine archetypes embodying different aspects of existence and different approaches to the challenges of maintaining cosmic order. Enlil the lawgiver, stern and unyielding. Enki the trickster, compassionate and creative. Ninhursag the mother, nurturing but finite. Inanna the lover and warrior, passionate and dangerous. Together they created the framework within which human civilization could emerge and flourish. And emerge it did, from the first small farming villages in the 6th millennium BCE to the great cities of the 3rd millennium, Uruk with its 100,000 inhabitants, Ur with its golden treasures, Nippur with its sacred temple, Babylon with its towering walls. These cities were marvels, unprecedented in human history, made possible by irrigation agriculture, writing, mathematics, metallurgy, and complex social organization. All of this emerged in the land between the rivers, and all of it was attributed to divine instruction and intervention. The legacy of this civilization extends far beyond the archaeological ruins scattered across Iraq. It extends into our modern world through mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, legal principles, literary motifs, and religious ideas that have been transmitted through multiple cultural intermediaries over thousands of years. When you check the time on your watch, you're using Sumerian base 60 mathematics. When you read Genesis, you're encountering stories shaped by Mesopotamian mythology. When you see the zodiac, you're looking at Babylonian astronomy. When you expect written laws to be publicly displayed and consistently applied, you're benefiting from principles first established in Mesopotamian law codes. So take a moment to appreciate the extraordinary achievement represented by these ancient texts. They are humanity's first attempts to write down our stories, our laws, our knowledge, our beliefs. They show us where writing itself came from, a Mesopotamian invention that spread throughout the world and became the foundation for all subsequent literature, science, history, and philosophy. They preserve the voices of people who lived and died thousands of years ago but who asked the same questions we ask, who feared the same things we fear, who hoped for the same things we hope for. What happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth? According to the Sumerian texts, what happened was us. Humanity emerged from clay and divine blood, mortal but touched by heaven, created to serve but capable of creating ourselves, destined to die but able to build things that outlive us. We are the continuation of the story that began in the Council of the Gods, when Enki proposed making humans to bear the burden of civilizing the earth. We are still bearing that burden, still transforming wilderness into cultivation, still building cities, still preserving memory, still asking why. The Sumerian scribes who pressed their style into wet clay 5,000 years ago could not have imagined this moment. You reading or hearing their stories in a language they never knew, in a world they could not have conceived. But they would understand the impulse that led you here, the desire to know where we came from, what forces shaped our world, what stories our ancestors told to make sense of existence. They shared that impulse. They honored it by writing it down, by preserving it, by passing it on. And now, thousands of years later, their stories survive. The cities are ruins, the kings are dust, the gods are forgotten. But the words remain, pressed into clay, waiting to be read, ready to teach us something about ourselves and our ancestors, about the long journey from the first cities of Mesopotamia to wherever we stand today. Before we end tonight's journey, I want to thank you for joining me in exploring these ancient texts. This is what makes history alive, not just memorizing dates and names, but reading the actual words of people long gone, understanding their thoughts and beliefs, connecting with their humanity across vast gulfs of time and culture. The Anunnaki may be gone, if they ever existed, as the Sumerians believed, but their stories remain, and those stories still have the power to move us, to make us think, to help us understand ourselves. If you enjoyed this journey into ancient Mesopotamia and the Sumerian understanding of divine creation, civilization, and humanity's place in the cosmos, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what aspect of Sumerian mythology interests you most, or suggest other topics you'd like me to explore in future videos. There's so much more to discover in these ancient texts, and I'm excited to continue exploring them with you. Thank you for watching, thank you for thinking, and thank you for keeping these ancient stories alive by listening to them and sharing them. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that we are all part of a story that began thousands of years ago in the dust and clay of Mesopotamia, when someone first pressed marks into clay and made thoughts permanent, when someone first looked at the stars and imagined gods, when someone first asked where we came from and why we're here. These are still our questions. The answers, or at least some of them, are waiting in the tablets of ancient Sumer. But before we truly end, let's delve even deeper into some specific aspects of these remarkable texts, because there's so much more to explore about what life was actually like after the Anunnaki established civilization, according to Sumerian sources. Consider the daily religious practices that maintained the relationship between humans and gods. These weren't occasional rituals performed only during festivals. They were constant, elaborate, and absolutely essential to maintaining cosmic order. Every temple in every city performed daily rituals following patterns that were believed to have been established by the gods themselves at the beginning of time. The day in a Sumerian temple began before dawn. Temple servants would enter the inner sanctum where the god statue resided. They would open the doors or curtains that had been closed for the night, symbolically waking the deity. Then began the morning toilet. The statue would be washed with pure water brought from sacred sources, anointed with fine oils, dressed in fresh linen garments, and adorned with jewelry. Musicians would play hymns announcing the god's awakening. Incense burners would be lit, filling the sanctuary with fragrant smoke. Then came the morning meal. Tables would be set before the statue with offerings of bread, dates, figs, beer, wine, and meat from sacrificed animals. The god was understood to consume the spiritual essence of the food, while the physical remains would later be distributed to the temple personnel as payment for their service. This wasn't symbolic. The Sumerians genuinely believed that the gods needed these offerings for sustenance, just as humans needed food. Throughout the day, there would be additional rituals, prayers at noon, offerings in the evening, and finally the closing ritual at night, when the statue would be prepared for sleep and the sanctuary sealed. This routine was performed every single day, without fail, for hundreds and eventually thousands of years. The continuity of these practices was considered essential to maintaining the god's presence in the city and ensuring divine favor. The priesthood responsible for these rituals was highly specialized. There were different classes of priests with different roles. The Anu high priest, often a member of the royal family, oversaw the entire temple complex. The Sangha priests managed the temple's economic activities, the vast agricultural estates and workshops that belonged to the temple. The Ishi priests performed purification rituals and exorcisms. The Gala priests were musicians and singers who performed the sacred hymns. Female priestesses, the Naditu, served goddesses like Inanna and played important roles in fertility rituals. Training for the priesthood began in childhood. Young boys and occasionally girls from elite families would be sent to the Aduba, the tablet house or scribal school, where they would spend years learning to read and write cuneiform. They would copy hundreds of tablets, memorizing Sumerian literature, learning mathematical tables, studying the stars, and absorbing the vast body of knowledge necessary to serve the gods properly. The curriculum was rigorous. Students began with simple signs and syllables, copying them over and over until the movements became automatic. They progressed to word lists, learning the Sumerian names for hundreds of objects, animals, plants, and concepts. Then came literary texts, myths and hymns that had to be memorized and copied perfectly. Mathematical instruction included multiplication tables, division problems, area calculations for surveying fields, and volume calculations for measuring grain storage. Astronomical tablets taught the movements of celestial bodies and the calendar system. The texts themselves reveal the structure of the school day. Students would arrive at dawn and work until midday, then have a break before returning for afternoon sessions. The teacher, called the Umir or master, was a stern figure who did not hesitate to use the rod to enforce discipline. Tablets survive containing student complaints about beatings for poor work or misbehavior, suggesting that Sumerian education was not gentle, but it was effective. The literate elite it produced maintained Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. Beyond the daily temple rituals, there were annual festivals that brought entire cities together in massive communal celebrations. The most important was the New Year festival, which lasted 12 days and involved processions, feasting, ritual combats, and sacred marriages. During this festival, the creation myth would be recited in full, reminding participants of how order was established from chaos. The king would participate in rituals that renewed his divine mandate to rule. The statue of the city's patron deity would be paraded through the streets, allowing common people who never entered the inner temple to see their god. These festivals were times of both celebration and anxiety. The New Year marked a moment of cosmic vulnerability when the forces of chaos threatened to overwhelm order. The rituals performed during the festival were understood as helping the gods maintain cosmic stability. If the rituals were performed incorrectly, if any detail was missed or any participant failed in their role, disaster might follow. The fate of the entire city, indeed the entire world, depended on getting every detail right. The sacred marriage ritual performed during some festivals involved the king and a high priestess enacting the union of the god and goddess, usually Inanna and Dumuzi. This ritual was understood to ensure fertility for the coming year, both agricultural fertility and human fertility. The hymns sung during this ritual were explicit and sensual, celebrating sexual union as a divine creative force that maintained life and abundance. Agricultural fertility was always precarious in Mesopotamia. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile's predictable annual flood brought rich silt and water to the fields, Mesopotamian rivers were unpredictable and dangerous. A flood at the wrong time could destroy crops. Insufficient flooding meant drought and famine. Even in good years, the irrigation systems required constant maintenance. Canals had to be dredged regularly to prevent silting. Dikes had to be reinforced. Water distribution had to be carefully managed to prevent some fields from being overwatered while others dried out. The organization of this irrigation work was one of the primary functions of early Sumerian government. City-states maintained corvée labor systems, where citizens were required to contribute work time to maintaining the canals. These work gangs, thousands of men laboring together under the supervision of overseers, dug new canals, repaired old ones, and built the infrastructure that made civilization possible. The parallel to the myth of the Igigi gods laboring at irrigation before humans were created is obvious and probably intentional. The myths provided a divine precedent for the labor organization that actually kept society functioning. The agricultural cycle determined the rhythm of life. Planting season came after the fall flooding subsided, around October or November. Barley and wheat were the staple crops, along with dates from the palm groves that lined the canals. Throughout the winter, fields had to be weeded and protected from birds and rodents. Irrigation water had to be carefully regulated. Spring brought the harvest, a critical time when everyone in the community participated in cutting, threshing, and storing the grain. The success or failure of the harvest determined whether the city would eat well or starve for the coming year. Storage of the harvested grain was centralized in temple and palace granaries. These massive mud brick structures could hold thousands of bushels of grain, providing insurance against bad years and supplies for the non-agricultural population, craftspeople, priests, soldiers, and administrators. The management of these granaries was complex, requiring careful accounting to track incoming harvests, outgoing rations, losses to spoilage and vermin, and reserves for planting next season's crops. This accounting need was one of the driving forces behind the invention of writing. Trade was another essential element of Mesopotamian civilization. The river plains lacked many essential resources. There was no stone suitable for building or sculpture, no metal ores for bronze making, no timber for shipbuilding or roof beams. All these had to be imported from distant lands through trade networks that stretched across the ancient Near East and beyond. Lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, copper from Oman and Anatolia, tin from unknown sources possibly as far away as Central Asia. Merchant caravans traveled these routes, facing dangers from bandits, hostile tribes, difficult terrain, and unpredictable weather. Sea trade through the Persian Gulf brought goods from the Indus Valley civilization, carnelian beads, ivory, exotic woods. Overland routes crossed the desert to Syria and Anatolia, or east toward the Iranian plateau. These merchants were often representatives of temple or palace economic enterprises, but there were also private merchants who traded on their own account, risking their capital for potential profit. The trade goods moving out of Mesopotamia included textiles, especially fine woolen cloth that Mesopotamian weavers were famous for producing, grain surpluses in good years, dates and date products, and finished manufactured goods. The Sumerians were skilled metalworkers who could cast bronze tools and weapons, create jewelry from gold and silver, and craft elaborate vessels and ceremonial objects. They produced cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with intricate scenes that could be rolled across clay to leave an impression, used to mark property and authenticate documents. These seals provide remarkable insights into Sumerian life and beliefs. Thousands survive in museums and private collections worldwide. They show scenes of gods and worshippers, mythological creatures, ritual activities, daily life, hunting, warfare, banqueting. Each seal was unique to its owner, like a personal signature, and the quality of carving varied from crude to exquisitely beautiful, depending on the skill of the artist and the wealth of the patron. The scenes on cylinder seals often depict the gods, and these depictions give us our best visual evidence for how Sumerians imagined the Anunnaki. Gods were shown as human in form but larger than mortals and distinguished by their horned crowns and elaborate garments. Enki is often depicted with flowing streams of water emerging from his shoulders, symbolizing his control of the rivers. Inanna appears with weapons and associated with the lion. Shamash, the sun god, radiates light, sometimes shown as flames rising from his shoulders. The iconography was standardized enough that even without accompanying inscriptions, scholars can usually identify which deity is being depicted. The relationship between humans and gods shown on these seals is one of worship and supplication. Mortals approach the gods with hands raised in prayer, or they are led into divine presence by intermediary deities. Sometimes the seal shows the god granting favor to the worshipper, presenting them with flowing water or vegetation symbols of divine blessing. Other scenes show the gods in council, seated on thrones, discussing matters among themselves while humans stand at a respectful distance. The physical appearance of the gods in Mesopotamian art evolved over time. Early depictions are simpler, more stylized. By the Akkadian period, around 2300 BCE, divine images become more naturalistic, showing individual facial features and elaborate costuming. The gods are shown wearing multiple horned crowns, the number of horns indicating their rank in the divine hierarchy. The supreme gods like Enlil and Anu wear crowns with 7 pairs of horns. Lesser deities might have 3 or 5 pairs. Human rulers sometimes wear simple horned crowns, showing their semi-divine status as intermediaries between heaven and earth. The artistic depiction of mythology extends beyond seals to relief sculptures on palace walls, paintings on pottery, and especially the votive statues placed in temples. These statues, carved from stone or modelled in terracotta, represented worshippers in perpetual prayer before the gods. A wealthy individual might commission a statue of themselves to be placed in the temple, where it would pray on their behalf even when they weren't physically present. The statue's prayer would continue indefinitely, earning divine favour for the patron. These votive statues are immediately recognizable by their distinctive style. Enormous eyes inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, hands clasped at the chest in prayer, simplified bodies often just suggesting the form beneath long garments. The huge eyes were particularly important, representing the worshipper's attentive gaze toward the divine, their vigilant observation of sacred space. The effect is haunting. These statues stare at you across 4,000 years with an intensity that still feels devotional. The mythology recorded in texts was also depicted in visual art, though often in abbreviated or symbolic form. The combat between the god Ninurta and the demon Anzu appears on seals and reliefs. The goddess Inanna, Ishtar's descent to the underworld, is represented symbolically. The flood story appears rarely, but when it does, it shows a boat riding. Waves with the flood hero making an offering. These images weren't just decorative, they were theological statements, reminding viewers of divine power and mythological precedents. The physical spaces where the gods dwelt, the temples, were architectural expressions of cosmic order. The ziggurat, the stepped pyramid that served as the base for the god's shrine, represented the cosmic mountain where heaven and earth met. Its vertical structure symbolized the axis mundi connecting the underworld, earth and heaven. Ascending the ziggurat's ramps or stairs, one moved closer to the divine realm, leaving the mundane world below. The largest ziggurats were enormous structures. The ziggurat at Ur, dedicated to Nanna the moon god, measured over 200 feet on each side at its base and rose to a height of 60 or 70 feet. It was built of millions of mud bricks, faced with fired bricks set in bitumen mortar. The corners were aligned to the cardinal directions with impressive precision. Ramps led to successive levels, finally reaching the shrine at the top where the god's statue resided. Inside the temple complex surrounding the ziggurat were many other buildings, courtyards where worshippers gathered, subsidiary shrines for other deities, administrative offices, storage rooms, workshops, living quarters for priests and temple workers. The whole complex functioned as a small city within the city, a sacred precinct separated from ordinary urban space by high walls. These temples were constantly being rebuilt and renovated. Mud brick construction is not permanent. Walls deteriorate, foundations settle, roofs leak. Every few generations, a temple would need major repairs or complete reconstruction. Kings gained prestige by sponsoring temple building projects, and foundation deposits commemorating these projects provide much of our information about Mesopotamian royal history. The king would describe how he rebuilt the temple according to ancient plans, returning it to its original divinely ordained form. The claim to be restoring ancient plans was important. Mesopotamian culture was deeply conservative in some ways, always looking backward to an ideal past when the gods established civilization. Innovation had to be framed as a restoration, returning to original divine intentions rather than creating something new. This conservatism helped maintain cultural continuity across centuries, but it also meant that actual innovations, and there were many, had to be credited to divine sources or presented as rediscoveries of ancient knowledge. The legal system is a good example of this conservative innovation. Law codes like the famous Code of Hammurabi present themselves as eternal divine law given to humanity at the beginning of time, now being recorded and promulgated by the king. But comparing different law codes from different periods shows clear evolution and adaptation. New economic circumstances required new regulations, changing social structures necessitated different approaches to family law, yet each new code claimed to be revealing eternal principles, not inventing new ones. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a massive stone stele and smaller clay tablets, contains nearly 300 laws covering everything from murder and theft to marriage and divorce, from property disputes to medical malpractice. It's famous for the principle of proportional justice, an eye for an eye, though in practice this only applied to equals. Punishments varied based on social class. If a noble injured another noble, they received the same injury. If a noble injured a commoner, they paid a fine. If a commoner injured a noble, they faced severe corporal punishment. This explicit hierarchy of social classes, nobles, commoners, and slaves, reflects the stratified nature of Mesopotamian society. Slavery existed, though it was different from later forms of chattel slavery. Many slaves were war captives or people who had fallen into debt and sold themselves or family members to pay obligations. Slaves had some legal protections. They could own property, conduct business, purchase their freedom, but they remained property of their masters, subject to sale, inheritance, and severe punishment for disobedience. Women's position in Mesopotamian society was complex and varied over time and between cities. In early Sumerian society, women appear to have had significant legal rights. They could own property, conduct business, serve as witnesses in legal cases, and even serve as priestesses wielding religious authority. Royal women sometimes ruled as regents or queens in their own right. The Sumerian king list records Kubaba, a tavern keeper who became Queen of Kish and founded a dynasty. But over time, and particularly under later Babylonian and Assyrian rule, women's rights became more restricted. Laws increasingly placed women under the authority of fathers and husbands. Adultery laws became asymmetrical, harshly punishing women, but largely ignoring men's sexual conduct outside marriage. Women's ability to own and control property was limited. Their testimony in court was given less weight. The patriarchal structure of society became more rigid. Yet even in these later, more restrictive periods, some women exercised significant power and influence. High priestesses of major temples controlled vast resources and wielded religious authority. Women in merchant families sometimes managed business affairs. Royal women in the palace influenced politics and policy. The gap between legal limitations and actual practice could be substantial, with capable, well-connected women finding ways to exercise agency despite formal restrictions. The position of women in mythology reflects these complex realities. The goddesses of the Mesopotamian pantheon were powerful figures. Inanna, Ishtar was the goddess of war and love, both traditional and transgressive, simultaneously embodying and challenging gender norms. Ninhursag was the creator goddess, source of all life. Ereshkigal ruled the underworld with absolute authority. These were not passive, secondary divine figures, but active, powerful beings who shaped the cosmos and human fate. Yet the myths also reflect patriarchal structures. The supreme deities were male, Anu, Enlil, Enki. The divine councils were dominated by male gods. Goddesses often achieved their goals through sexuality and seduction, rather than direct power. The tension between powerful female deities and patriarchal divine hierarchy mirrors tensions in human society, where women could wield significant influence within certain spheres while formal authority remained male. Family structure was the foundation of Mesopotamian society. The extended family, including multiple generations living in one household compound, was the basic economic and social unit. Marriages were arranged by families, usually to create economic alliances and strengthen kin networks. Love might develop after marriage but wasn't considered necessary beforehand. The primary purposes of marriage were economic cooperation and reproduction, particularly producing sons to inherit property and continue the family line. Contracts governed marriage, as they governed most aspects of Mesopotamian life. Marriage contracts specified the bride price paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, the dowry provided by the bride's family, and the conditions under which the marriage could be dissolved. Divorce was possible, though easier for men than women. A man could divorce his wife for various reasons, including infertility, but he had to return her dowry. A woman could divorce her husband only under specific circumstances, and she faced social stigma and economic vulnerability afterward. Children were highly valued, especially sons, but childhood was not sentimentalized as it often is in modern Western culture. Children were expected to contribute to household labor from an early age and to show absolute obedience to parents. Sons inherited property and social position from fathers, though inheritance systems varied between cities and periods. Some systems divided property equally among sons, others gave preference to the eldest, still others allowed fathers to designate preferred heirs regardless of birth order. Education was limited to elite families who could afford to send sons to scribal schools. Most children learned their parents' occupations through apprenticeship, working alongside adults from early age. Girls were trained by mothers in household management, weaving, cooking, and other domestic skills. By early teens, most people were considered adults, ready for marriage and adult responsibilities. Life expectancy was much lower than today. Many children died in infancy from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Women faced high mortality risks from childbirth. Men might be killed in warfare, accidents, or violence. Living to old age, which might mean the 40s or 50s, was an achievement worthy of respect. The elderly who survived were honored for their wisdom and experience, but they were also vulnerable if they could no longer work and had no family to support them. Disease was constant and often fatal. Mesopotamians understood some diseases as natural phenomena caused by bad food, contaminated water, or environmental conditions, but many illnesses were attributed to supernatural causes, divine punishment, demonic possession, or sorcery by enemies. Treatment therefore involved both practical medicine and magical rituals. Medical texts catalogued symptoms and treatments, some remarkably effective. Mesopotamian physicians knew how to set broken bones, suture wounds, perform minor surgery, and prescribe herbal remedies. They made poultices from plants, administered mineral compounds, used animal products for medicinal purposes. Some of their remedies had genuine therapeutic value, Others were useless or even harmful, but the empirical observation underlying their practice was sound. Alongside practical medicine stood therapeutic rituals performed by exorcist priests, the Ashipu. These practitioners diagnosed supernatural causes of illness through divination, reading omens in the livers of sacrificed animals or the patterns of oil dropped into water. Having identified the cause, they would perform elaborate rituals to drive out demons, lift divine curses, or counter the effects of sorcery. These rituals involved incantations, purification with water and fire, fumigation with incense, and the manufacture of protective amulets. From a modern perspective, these magical treatments seem superstitious and ineffective, but they provided psychological comfort to patients and families, gave them a sense of control over frightening illnesses, and sometimes their herbal components had legitimate therapeutic effects. More importantly, they were part of a coherent worldview that made sense of suffering and provided frameworks for dealing with it. Death, when it came, was feared not for physical pain but for the nature of the afterlife. The Mesopotamian underworld, Kur or Irkala, was a gloomy realm beneath the earth where the dead existed as shadows eating dust and clay. There was no heavenly reward for the righteous, no punishment for the wicked beyond what they experienced in life. All the dead, regardless of virtue or status, went to the same dreary place. The only differences in the underworld related to burial practices and descendants' remembrance. Those who were properly buried with appropriate offerings fared slightly better than those whose bodies were left unburied. Those who had living descendants to pour libations and make offerings at their graves received some benefit. The childless dead, who had no one to remember them, suffered the worst fate, complete neglect and oblivion. This belief system placed enormous emphasis on having children, especially sons who could perform the necessary funeral rites and ongoing memorial obligations. It also encouraged proper burial practices, which could be elaborate for the wealthy. Royal tombs at Ur contained not just the king's body, but dozens of retainers who apparently willingly drank poison and were entombed with their ruler, continuing to serve him in death as they had in life. Whether these retainers truly went willingly or were coerced is debated, but the practice shows how seriously the Sumerians took the provision for afterlife needs. Ghosts were real and potentially dangerous in Mesopotamian belief. The dead who were improperly buried, who died violently, or who were not remembered by descendants could return as malevolent ghosts to trouble the living. Illnesses might be attributed to ghostly attack. Nightmares were caused by dead relatives demanding attention. Elaborate rituals existed for appeasing angry ghosts and ensuring that the dead remained peacefully in the underworld where they belonged. The mythology around death and the underworld is extensive. The descent of Inanna is the most famous underworld myth, telling how the goddess travelled to the land of the dead to attend a funeral, possibly her sister Ereshkigal's husband. Inanna had to pass through 7 gates, at each surrendering one of her divine powers symbolized by items of clothing and jewelry. Finally, she stood naked and powerless before Ereshkigal, who killed her with a glance and hung her corpse from a hook. 3 days and nights passed before Inanna's loyal servant Ninshuba, following Inanna's instructions, sought help from the gods. Enlil and Nanna refused to help, saying Inanna had brought this on herself by entering the underworld. But Enki, compassionate as always, devised a plan. He created 2 beings from the dirt under his fingernails, neither male nor female, and sent them to the underworld with food and water for Ereshkigal, who was mourning. Grateful for their sympathy, Ereshkigal granted them a wish, and they asked for Inanna's corpse. Bringing Inanna back to life, they led her toward the upper world, but there was a catch. Underworld law required that if someone left, another must take their place. Demons followed Inanna, demanding a substitute. She refused to sacrifice her faithful servants, but found her husband Dumuzi sitting on her throne, apparently not mourning her death. Enraged, she designated him as her replacement. Dumuzi fled, pursued by demons, but was eventually caught and dragged to the underworld. His sister Geshtinana mourned so sincerely that a compromise was reached. Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld, while Geshtinana took his place. Then they would switch. This myth explained the agricultural cycle, the seasons when the earth was fertile and when it lay dormant. Dumuzi represented vegetation that dies and is reborn, the eternal cycle of life and death that governed agricultural existence. The journey through the underworld and the return to life became a pattern for later myths and religious ideas. The descent through multiple stages, the loss of power and identity, the death and rebirth, the sacrificial substitute, these motifs appear in many later traditions. They spoke to deep anxieties about mortality and hopes for renewal, even as Mesopotamian theology officially denied any hope of escaping death's finality. Magic and witchcraft were serious concerns in Mesopotamian society. People believed that sorcerers could curse enemies, causing illness, impotence, business failure, or death. Elaborate counter-magic existed to protect against such attacks. Clay figurines of enemies could be buried with curse tablets. Protective amulets were worn. Incantations were recited. Rituals involving sympathetic magic, burning effigies of demons or washing away evil influences were performed. The line between legitimate priestly magic and illegitimate sorcery was defined by social authorization. Priests performed rituals that benefited the community and individual clients openly, with divine sanction. Sorcerers worked in secret, harming others for personal gain or revenge without divine approval, but the techniques were often similar, showing that the distinction was more about social legitimacy than methodology. Divination was practiced constantly at all levels of society. Before any major decision, kings, generals, and wealthy individuals would consult diviners to read omens. The most prestigious form of divination was extispicy, examining the liver and other organs of sacrificed sheep. The liver was seen as a microcosm reflecting divine intentions, and trained diviners could read dozens of features: the shape of particular lobes, the color and texture, the presence of abnormalities, to determine whether the gods favored a proposed action. Other divination methods included oil divination, dropping oil into water and interpreting the patterns formed, smoke divination, reading the rise and movement of incense smoke, and dream interpretation, analyzing dreams for divine messages. Astronomical omens were particularly important. Eclipses, planetary positions, unusual weather phenomena all carried significance. Massive omen catalogues recorded traditional interpretations. If the liver is shaped thus, the king will die. If Mars appears in the constellation of the Scorpion, there will be war, and so on. These divination practices rested on the belief that the gods communicated their will through signs in nature. The universe was not random but ordered according to divine plan, and those who knew how to read the signs could discern that plan. This gave diviners enormous influence, as kings relied on their advice before military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and major building projects. A negative omen could cancel planned actions, while a positive omen might encourage risky ventures. The relationship between divination and fate was complex. Mesopotamians believed in fate, the idea that certain outcomes were predetermined by the gods. But they also believed these fates could potentially be altered through proper ritual action, through appeasing the gods, through magic, or through divine mercy. Divination helped identify what fate the gods had decreed so that humans could either accept it or attempt to change it through appropriate responses. This tension between fate and free will, between divine omnipotence and human agency, runs through Mesopotamian thought. The gods were powerful and could decree fates, but they were not omniscient or unchangeable. They could be persuaded, deceived, or even forced to change their minds by sufficiently powerful magic or appeals. Humans were subject to divine will but not completely powerless. We could influence outcomes through proper behavior, ritual observance, and clever action. Warfare was a constant feature of Mesopotamian life, with city-states frequently fighting over water rights, territory, trade routes, and prestige. Sumerian cities maintained professional soldiers and could conscript citizen militia in times of need. Weapons evolved from stone and copper to bronze and eventually iron. Armies consisted of infantry armed with spears, axes, and bows, protected by leather or bronze armor and large shields. Chariots, introduced around 2000 BCE, provided mobile platforms for archers and gave armies new tactical options. Siege warfare was particularly important in a region dominated by walled cities. Siege equipment included battering rams, siege towers, and tunneling under walls. Defenders could pour boiling oil, shoot arrows from walls, and sortie out to attack besiegers. Sieges could last months or even years, with victory often depending on which side ran out of food first. Victory in war was attributed to divine favor. Kings claimed their conquests were undertaken at divine command and with divine assistance. Battle accounts described gods fighting invisibly alongside human armies, striking terror into enemies. Defeat was explained as divine punishment for some failing, or as the enemy's god temporarily proving stronger. This theological framework justified warfare as an extension of divine will and cosmic order. Captives from defeated cities faced enslavement, execution, or deportation. Entire populations might be relocated to prevent rebellion, a practice the Assyrians later perfected. War was brutal, and victory celebrations included displaying defeated enemies' heads on stakes, taking parts of enemy bodies as trophies, and publicly humiliating captured rulers. These practices demonstrated the victor's power and the god's favor. Yet warfare also had limits. Truces could be negotiated, peace treaties concluded, diplomatic marriages arranged to cement alliances. The same cities that fought each other in one generation might ally in the next against common enemies. Trade continued even between hostile cities because economic interdependence transcended political conflict. Merchants operated under divine protection, with attacks on them considered sacrilege that brought divine punishment. The military campaigns and diplomatic relations between cities over centuries created a shared political culture across Mesopotamia. Cities recognized each other's legitimacy, honored treaties, exchanged ambassadors, and participated in a common international system. This system was always unstable, constantly reshaping through conquest and alliance, but it provided some structure to interstate relations and helped prevent complete anarchy. The great empires that eventually unified Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire under Sargon, the Ur-3 Empire, the Old Babylonian Kingdom under Hammurabi, and later the Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, built on these earlier patterns of city-state interaction. They claimed to be restoring ancient unity, reuniting the land that the gods had originally intended to be one kingdom under one ruler. Empire was framed as a return to cosmic order, with the imperial king acting as shepherd of all peoples under divine mandate. But empires were unstable, requiring constant military enforcement and administrative oversight to maintain. When central authority weakened, the system fragmented back into competing city-states and regional kingdoms. This cycle of unity and fragmentation repeated throughout Mesopotamian history, each empire rising with claims of restoring ancient glory, each eventually collapsing and giving way to the next. Through all these political changes, the fundamental patterns of Mesopotamian civilization persisted. The irrigation agriculture, the cuneiform writing, the ziggurat temples, the legal codes, the astronomical observations, the mythological traditions, all these continued with remarkable stability. Cultural continuity transcended political disruption. The myths of the Anunnaki were copied and recopied, adapted and updated, but never fundamentally changed. Enlil remained Enlil, Enki remained Enki. The creation of humanity from clay remained central to self-understanding. This cultural resilience is remarkable and speaks to the power of the mythological and religious framework that gave Mesopotamian civilization its identity. Even when cities fell and dynasties ended, even when foreign peoples conquered and ruled, the basic worldview persisted. The gods still dwelt in temples, still required offerings, still decreed fates, still explained why the world was as it was. What happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to the full scope of Sumerian and Babylonian texts, was the creation of a complete civilization with all its complexity, brutality, beauty, and sophistication. It was agriculture and warfare, poetry and accounting, law and magic, divine order and human agency, all existing together in constant tension and occasional harmony. What happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to the full scope of Sumerian and Babylonian texts, was the creation of a complete civilization with all its complexity, brutality, beauty, and sophistication. It was agriculture and warfare, poetry and accounting, law and magic, divine order and human agency, all existing together in constant tension and occasional harmony. Before we truly conclude, let's explore one more crucial aspect of this story: the remarkable journey these texts took from the ancient world to modern scholarship, because understanding how we know what we know adds another layer of depth to our appreciation of these ancient narratives. When the last cuneiform tablet was inscribed sometime in the 1st century CE, the knowledge of how to read and write in cuneiform died with the scribes who possessed it. For nearly 2,000 years, the myths of the Anunnaki, the stories of human creation, the epics of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, all these texts existed physically in the ruins of ancient cities, but were completely incomprehensible. Travelers to Mesopotamia described the strange brick-shaped objects covered with wedge-shaped marks, but no one could read them. European interest in Mesopotamia initially focused on biblical connections. Christians wanted to find physical evidence for stories in the Old Testament, particularly the Tower of Babel and the Flood. In the early 1900s, archaeological expeditions began excavating the great mounds that marked ancient city sites. These mounds, called tells in Arabic, had accumulated over centuries as mud brick buildings decayed and new structures were built on top of the ruins. Layer upon layer of human occupation created artificial hills that rose above the surrounding plains. The first major discoveries came from Nineveh, where Austin Henry Layard excavated the palaces of Assyrian kings in the 1840s. His finds caused a sensation in Europe: massive stone reliefs showing winged bulls with human heads, battle scenes, royal hunts, and depictions of Assyrian conquest. But more important for understanding Mesopotamian literature were the tens of thousands of clay tablets found in the palace libraries. Layard and his colleagues shipped these tablets back to the British Museum, where they sat in storage for years because no one could read them. The decipherment of cuneiform required decades of patient work by multiple scholars. The breakthrough came from the Behistun inscription in Persia, a massive rock carving containing the same text in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Since Old Persian could be partially read, it provided a key to deciphering the other scripts. Henry Rawlinson played a crucial role, copying the Behistun inscription while dangling from a cliff face, risking his life for scholarship. Edward Hincks, Julius Oppert and others worked on identifying individual signs and words. Slowly, painfully, the cuneiform syllabary was reconstructed. By the 1870s, scholars could read Akkadian, the Semitic, language of Babylon and Assyria, with reasonable accuracy. Sumerian proved much harder. It was a language unrelated to any known language family, with complex grammar and thousands of signs. Early scholars struggled to distinguish Sumerian texts from Akkadian ones. Some thought Sumerian was merely an archaic form of Akkadian. It took decades to recognize that Sumerian was a completely separate language, preserved in bilingual dictionaries that Babylonian scribes had created to help them read ancient texts. The first major translation triumph came in 1872, when George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum, deciphered and translated the flood story from the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. Smith announced his discovery at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology, causing enormous excitement. Here was a flood narrative predating Genesis, showing that the biblical story had Mesopotamian antecedents. The discovery made headlines, funded further expeditions, and revolutionized understanding of ancient Near Eastern literature. Smith himself led an expedition to Nineveh, hoping to find missing portions of the Gilgamesh epic. Remarkably, he succeeded, finding fragments that filled some gaps in the narrative, but the expedition cost him his life. He fell ill with dysentery and died in Aleppo on the journey home. His work, however, continued through others, and gradually more tablets were discovered, translated, and published. Excavations expanded to other sites. Ancient seat of the moon god, yielded royal tombs filled with gold treasures and evidence of human sacrifice. Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, produced thousands of tablets, many containing Sumerian literary texts that had been copied in scribble schools. Lagash, Kish, Uruk, Babylon, all the great cities were excavated, each contributing to the growing corpus of cuneiform texts. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Estimates suggest that over 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been excavated, and many more remain buried. Most are mundane administrative documents, receipts, contracts, legal records, the paperwork of ancient civilization. But among them are the literary, religious, and scientific texts that reveal Mesopotamian intellectual culture, hymns, myths, epics, wisdom literature, medical texts, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, omen collections, law codes, royal inscriptions, and personal letters. Organizing, cataloguing, and translating this vast archive has been the work of generations of scholars. Major research projects have created comprehensive dictionaries of Sumerian and Akkadian. The Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary and Chicago Assyrian Dictionary are monumental achievements, each running to multiple large volumes, analyzing thousands of words with examples from hundreds of texts. These dictionaries enable more accurate translations and help scholars understand subtle nuances in ancient terminology. Digital technology has revolutionized access to these texts. The Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, ETCSL, provides transliterations and translations of Sumerian literary texts freely online. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, CDLI, aims to catalogue and make available images of all published cuneiform texts. Scholars can now access tablets from collections worldwide without travelling to museums, compare different versions of text instantly, and use computational tools to analyze patterns across thousands of documents. This technological transformation has accelerated research and enabled new types of questions. How did scribal schools teach writing? What patterns exist in economic documents that reveal trade networks? How did literary texts change over time as they were copied and recopied? Digital humanities approaches are revealing new insights into Mesopotamian civilization that earlier scholars couldn't have discovered. But technological sophistication hasn't eliminated fundamental challenges. Many tablets are fragmentary, broken by time, looting, or archaeological excavation. Reconstructing original text from scattered fragments is like assembling jigsaw puzzles, where most pieces are missing and you don't have a picture to work from. Sometimes fragments from different tablets can be joined, restoring lost passages. Other times gaps remain unfillable, leaving frustrating lacunae in our knowledge. Translation itself involves constant interpretation and debate. Cuneiform signs can have multiple meanings depending on context. Grammar rules must be inferred from usage patterns since no ancient grammar textbooks survive. Idiomatic expressions may not translate directly into modern languages. Scholarly translations often include brackets indicating uncertain readings, parentheses showing added words needed for English to make sense, and footnotes discussing alternative interpretations. Reading ancient texts is never straightforward. Moreover, the tablets themselves raise questions about authenticity and provenance. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, excavation standards were poor. Objects were often removed without proper documentation, mixed between sites, or sold on the antiquities market. Modern excavations maintain rigorous records, but many tablets in museum collections lack clear provenance information, making it difficult to determine when and where they were created. The illegal antiquities trade continues to plague the field. Wars in Iraq and Syria in recent decades led to massive looting of archaeological sites, with thousands of tablets stolen and sold to private collectors. Some eventually surface in museums or auctions, others remain in private hands, inaccessible to scholars. This ongoing destruction of archaeological context is a tragedy, erasing irreplaceable information about ancient civilization. Despite these challenges, our understanding of Mesopotamian culture has grown exponentially since the first cuneiform decipherments. We can now read royal inscriptions in the king's own words, follow the daily operations of temples through their administrative archives, trace economic transactions across generations of merchant families, read private letters revealing personal concerns and relationships, and study the full corpus of Mesopotamian literature in its original languages. This scholarly achievement has revealed a civilization of remarkable sophistication. The mathematical texts show advanced algebraic thinking, with problem sets that could challenge modern students. Astronomical tablets demonstrate centuries of careful observation and sophisticated predictive models. Medical texts show empirical approaches to diagnosis and treatment. Legal codes reflect complex thinking about justice, social order, and conflict resolution. Literary texts display sophisticated narrative techniques, complex characterization, and exploration of profound philosophical questions. The Anunnaki, within this scholarly understanding, emerge not as ancient astronauts, but as the gods of a sophisticated polytheistic religion. They were divine personalities with complex relationships, representing natural forces, social principles, and aspects of human experience. They provided explanatory frameworks for understanding the world and human existence. They sanctioned social institutions and political authority. They gave meaning to suffering and hope in the face of mortality, even if that hope was limited. Understanding Mesopotamian religion requires acknowledging that these people genuinely believed in these gods. They weren't primitive dupes fooled by clever priests, though priests certainly wielded power. They were intelligent people making sense of their world using the intellectual tools available to them. The gods explained why rivers flooded, why diseases struck, why some people prospered while others suffered, why death came to all. The myths provided narratives that made existence comprehensible within a coherent worldview. Modern readers approaching these texts must balance several perspectives. We can appreciate the literary artistry, the skill of the poets and storytellers who created these narratives. We can analyze the social functions, how myths legitimized political power, reinforced social norms, and maintained cultural cohesion. We can examine the theological sophistication, the complex thinking about divine nature and human-divine relationships. We can trace historical influences, how these stories evolved and spread to influence other cultures. But we should also try to understand these texts as their original audiences did, as sacred narratives revealing fundamental truths about existence. The creation of humans from clay and divine blood wasn't just an origin story, but a profound statement about human nature. We are both earthly and divine, material and spiritual, mortal and yet touched by eternity. The flood wasn't just a story about divine punishment, but an exploration of justice, mercy, and the relationship between authority and compassion. The Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't entertainment, but a meditation on mortality, friendship, the meaning of civilization, and the proper use of power. It asks questions that remain relevant. What does it mean to be human? How should we face death? What responsibilities do rulers have to those they govern? What balance should exist between ambition and acceptance, between striving and contentment? These aren't primitive questions. They're fundamental human concerns, explored with sophistication and insight. When we read that Enlil sent the flood because human noise disturbed his sleep, we might first think this is petty anthropomorphism. a childish projection of human pettiness onto divine beings. But deeper reading reveals more complexity. The noise might represent humanity's growing independence, our refusal to remain quiet and submissive, our increasing boldness in claiming space and agency. Enlil's response represents the authoritarian impulse to crush dissent and maintain absolute control. Enki's intervention represents the compassionate impulse to preserve life even when it's troublesome. The story explores tensions between order and freedom, authority and mercy, that remain relevant in any society. Similarly, the creation of humans as servants to the gods might initially seem to be justifying slavery and oppression. But it can also be read as acknowledging the reality that work is necessary for civilization, that transforming wilderness into cultivated land requires labor, that society depends on people fulfilling necessary tasks. The question isn't whether work must be done, but how to organize it fairly, how to ensure that those who labor receive just compensation, how to prevent the powerful from exploiting the weak. These remain pressing questions today. The relationship between humans and gods in Mesopotamian thought, one of mutual dependence despite power inequality, mirrors relationships within human society, between rulers and subjects, parents and children, employers and workers. The gods needed human offerings as much as humans needed divine favor. This mutual dependence created obligations on both sides. If gods were too harsh, humans might turn to other gods. If humans were too rebellious, gods might destroy them. The tension created by this mutual dependence drove much of Mesopotamian myth and ritual. Modern interpretations that reduce these myths to alien visitation stories miss all this richness. They flatten complex theological and philosophical explorations into simple, literal narratives about extraterrestrial mining operations. They attribute to aliens what should be credited to human genius: the invention of agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, architecture, and literature. They assume ancient people were too primitive to develop these innovations themselves, which is both incorrect and insulting. The actual Sumerian texts show people who were fully as intelligent and creative as modern humans, working with the knowledge and technology available to them, asking profound questions, creating sophisticated answers, building remarkable civilization. They didn't need alien intervention to invent writing. They needed complex administrative demands, economic record-keeping, and the insight that marks in clay could preserve information. They didn't need extraterrestrial instruction to develop mathematics. They needed to survey fields, calculate grain stores, and solve practical problems. The Anunnaki, as understood within Mesopotamian culture, were expressions of how the Sumerians and Babylonians understood the divine forces governing existence. They were the power behind the storm that could destroy crops or bring needed rain. They were the wisdom that guided righteous kings and clever craftspeople. They were the fertility that brought children and abundant harvests. They were the justice that, imperfectly and inconsistently, tried to maintain social order. They were, in short, humanity's attempt to understand and relate to powers beyond human control. This understanding makes the texts more valuable, not less. They become windows into how one of history's great civilizations thought about fundamental questions. They show us alternative ways of conceptualizing divinity, morality, social order, and human purpose. They demonstrate that there are many ways to create meaning and structure existence, that our modern Western assumptions about religion, ethics, and society are not universal or inevitable, but contingent historical developments. The transmission of these ideas across cultures and millennia shows their power and resonance. When Hebrew scribes in the first millennium BCE composed Genesis, they drew on Mesopotamian traditions they knew from Babylonian exile or earlier cultural contact. They adapted the creation narrative, the garden paradise, the flood story, transforming them within a monotheistic framework but preserving core narrative structures. These stories then passed into Christianity and Islam, reaching billions of people who have no idea of their Mesopotamian origins. Similarly, Greek philosophers encountered Mesopotamian thought through Persian intermediaries and incorporated some ideas into their own systems. The concept of cosmic order, of divine law governing the universe, of the relationship between earthly and heavenly justice, all these show Mesopotamian influence on Greek philosophy, which in turn shaped all of Western intellectual history. Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge passed through Greek, Islamic and European hands, becoming the foundation for modern astronomy. Mathematical techniques developed in Babylonian scribal schools influenced Greek mathematics and eventually global mathematical practice. Legal principles established in Mesopotamian law codes influenced later legal systems throughout the Near East and Mediterranean world. Even Mesopotamian mythology that didn't directly transfer to other cultures still shaped the general narrative patterns and archetypes that recur throughout world literature. The hero's quest for immortality, the descent to the underworld, the divine council debating human fate, the catastrophic flood survived by a chosen few, the theft of divine powers, the separation of civilization and wilderness, all these narrative patterns established in Mesopotamian literature appear in countless later works from countless cultures. Understanding these connections helps us appreciate the unity of human cultural development. We're not isolated modern people looking at completely foreign ancient cultures. We're participants in continuous traditions that stretch back thousands of years, often without our realizing it. When we measure time in hours and minutes, we're using Babylonian base 60 mathematics. When we identify zodiac constellations, we're seeing patterns Mesopotamian astronomers defined. When we expect written laws to be publicly displayed, we're following principles established by Mesopotamian law codes. And when we tell stories about creation, floods, heroes seeking immortality, or the relationship between gods and mortals, we're continuing narrative traditions that began in Sumerian temples and scribal schools 5,000 years ago. The specific details change, the theological frameworks shift, the cultural contexts transform, but the underlying questions and narrative patterns persist because they address fundamental aspects of human existence that transcend any particular time or place. What happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth? A tradition of thought, story, and culture emerged that has shaped human civilization ever since. Not through alien intervention, but through human creativity, intelligence, and the hard work of maintaining civilization generation after generation. The Sumerians looked at their world, asked how it came to be, and created profound mythological answers. Their descendants preserved those answers in clay, and eventually scholars learned to read those preserved texts, making ancient wisdom available again. We are the latest recipients of that tradition, reading Gilgamesh and Atrahasis and Enuma Elish in translation, learning about Enki and Enlil and Inanna, understanding how the Mesopotamians explained human creation and the Great Flood. We can accept their answers, reject them, or modify them according to our own beliefs. But we should first understand them accurately, in their full complexity and sophistication, giving the ancient Mesopotamians credit for their remarkable achievements and insights. The clay tablets that preserve these stories are fragile. Many have been destroyed over the centuries by human conflict, environmental damage, or simple neglect. Many more remain buried in unexcavated tells or sit in museum storage waiting for scholars to study them. But enough survive, enough have been excavated, catalogued, translated, and published that we can reconstruct Mesopotamian civilization in remarkable detail. We can read their words, understand their thoughts, appreciate their achievements. This is perhaps the ultimate answer to what happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth. Memory survived. Despite the fall of cities, the death of languages, the collapse of civilizations, the sacred texts were preserved. Not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently that we can still hear ancient voices speaking across millennia. We can still encounter Gilgamesh grieving for his friend, Atrahasis building his ark, Enki saving humanity from Enlil's wrath, Inanna descending to the underworld. These stories live because people, generation after generation, considered them worth preserving. Scribes copied them carefully, libraries stored them protectively, archaeologists excavated them professionally, scholars translated them accurately. And now, in the 21st century, anyone with internet access can read the Epic of Gilgamesh, can study the Atrahasis creation narrative, can explore the Enuma Elish. Ancient wisdom has become universally available in ways the original authors could never have imagined. So as we conclude this journey through Sumerian texts and Mesopotamian mythology, remember that you're participating in a very old tradition. You're doing what those ancient scribes hoped someone would do, reading their words, engaging with their ideas, keeping their stories alive. You're continuing the chain of transmission that stretches from Sumerian temple schools through Babylonian libraries to British museums and digital archives, and finally to this moment, right now, as you hear or read these words. The Anunnaki may be gone, if they ever existed outside Mesopotamian imagination. The cities they dwelt in are ruins. The civilization that worshipped them has vanished. But the stories survive, the profound explorations of what it means to be human, to build civilization, to face mortality, to seek meaning in existence. These stories survive because they addressed questions that every generation must answer for itself. Where did we come from? Why are we here? How should we live? What happens when we die? The Sumerian answers, preserved in cuneiform on clay tablets, may not be our answers, but they deserve respect, attention, and accurate understanding. They represent one of humanity's first systematic attempts to answer these fundamental questions, and they did so with remarkable sophistication, creativity, and insight. That's what really happened after the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to Sumerian texts. Civilization happened, with all its complexity and contradiction, and that civilization left us texts, thousands of clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, carrying stories and ideas that still resonate 5,000 years later. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. Thank you for caring enough about ancient history to spend time learning about it. Thank you for helping keep these ancient stories alive by listening to them and thinking about them. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Sumerian mythology and Mesopotamian civilization, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. There's always more to explore in these ancient texts, more stories to tell, more insights to discover. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that we stand on the shoulders of countless previous generations, building on foundations laid thousands of years ago by people who looked at the same stars we see and asked the same questions we ask. The Anunnaki may be mythological, but the human quest for meaning that created those myths is as real as it ever was and as urgent. Good night.